All right, welcome back. We are in module 6, which is the 5 elements of cinematography, and we're about to begin. Just a bit of a, I guess not a warning, I should say, but as a note, this is probably the most content-heavy presentation of the formal tools, so just keep that in mind. I know it's going to be a lot of content, but just stay with me and again participate with the prompts along the way, and I think this will make sense. Okay. So the 5 elements of cinematography. Let me do that. Use my little tool here. Okay. So again, just kind of as a primer, this presentation is going to get into the details of how the elements of cinematography are used and things you should be looking out for in a film for filmic evidence, which we'll talk about later when we get to analysis, of how the director and cinematographer are using the tools of cinematography, the formal elements of cinematography to encode a scene with meaning. All right, so again, cinematography, it's a high level of encoding. There's a reason why I spread this over 3 modules. When we think of film, we think of the image first, right? That's the first thing we think about. A movie is motion pictures, right? Pictures in motion. So again, cinematography is just the photographic elements of a film, how the scene is lit and shot. And we're going to get a little bit more complicated than that today, but in a good way. The cinematographer is there to visually realize the director's vision. They're also called the director of photography or the DOP. So just keep that in mind. The director of photography are usually the people in charge of these elements. They're overseeing these elements in collaboration with the director. And directors, what's what I'm looking for? Supervision can range. Some directors are very hands-on and even act as their own cinematographers, like Steven Soderbergh. But other directors, only want to work with the actors and really mold a performance, and they leave a lot of the lighting and framing choices to the cinematographer. So it depends. But the director of photography oversees / dictates lighting choices, shot / framing choices, and camera movement with the director. So again, for us, we're just going to keep in mind that the director is working closely with the cinematographer. All right, so again, the previous presentation was just sort of a bit of context, but this module is again getting into the details of 5 elements of cinematography. So you may want to be taking some notes during this. And there's also less videos. A lot of this is just us looking at individual frames. Okay. So here we go, the 5 elements of cinematography. We have lighting, the setup, composition, camera movement, and color palette. And each one of these 5 elements have several subcategories that we are going to investigate. So again, hopefully this doesn't get too complicated, but for now, just take note of the 5 elements of cinematography, and we are going to go much further with each one of them. Okay. So we sort of did this activity with the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, the scene of Jesse James or the cowboy or Brad Pitt waiting at the train station as the train arrives. And I asked you what sort of feelings were sort of running through you in that scene. And I want you to keep that in mind. When we start looking at these properties of cinematography, you always need to keep questioning the why. Why do you think these choices are being made? How are they impacting you? And if they're not impacting you, then why do you think the director and cinematographer took the effort to make these choices where they could have just set up the camera in a wide shot and shot it as is and not worry about the shape of the light and where the shadows are going to be or why we should even bring out the dolly. So always consider motive, and also just like, what is it making you feel? So lighting, this is what we're going to start with, and I'm just going to talk over this picture for just a second. Sorry, I got my cough drop. But lighting for film is used in a variety of ways, right? There's sort of a very basic exposure level of lighting, but what we're going to be exploring is like stylistic lighting, right? Lighting used to, again, act as a formal tool to encode a scene with meaning. And what we're seeing here, I'm just going to point out a few things. This kind of goes back to, excuse my cough drop, sorry. This goes back to that picture I showed you with film history. And we see the scene being shot, right? It looks like there's two actors. There's a boom mic. I don't really see the camera. I don't know. Maybe they're blocked by something. But anyway, here's the scene, right? We see it way in the distance here. But now go a step back and look at all of the elements of lighting taking place. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I got them all. 5 lights set up. And notice none of them are even being directed directly on the scene. Instead, they're being used to throw in ambient lighting. They're being used to set just some atmosphere for the scene. And what you're seeing here with this is called a bounce. What they're doing is they're using a technique called bouncing the light, where you literally shine the light on a source, and in this case, it's acting as a bounce to sort of reflect the light through. It's not tough spun, but a reflective source that's also going to soften it a bit onto the subjects. Same thing with these overhead lights. You see these, I don't know what you would call these, but these sort of containers that hold light within it, which again just diffuses the light, softens the light a little bit to provide some overhead lighting. What we're seeing over here, it looks to be a little bit of accent lighting, right? Again, we can't really see where the camera is, but I'm assuming they're kind of taking the shot from over here, and you're just seeing a little bit of light on the set. So it's going to pop out maybe a background of the shot that we're seeing within the frame. Okay. So lighting fixtures. I'm going to talk about lighting fixtures, and just because I'm filming this at my house and these are exactly the lights that I have. I'm going to show you these in just a second. You're going to see a jump cut pretty soon. But anyway, lighting fixtures. So these are studio lights. Again, rarely are you going to a location and just filming with like whatever lights are there, right? You have to add light to get an exposed image, even if you're shooting digitally, or to get a properly exposed image, I should say. And if the cinematographer and director want to, use the lighting in a deliberate way, either as a stylistic choice, telling you what you should be looking at, shaping shadows, all those things. So we have different light sources here. A couple of things I just kind of want to focus on is most lighting now is done with LED lights. And here we have like an LED panel, but back in the day, they used to use lights kind of like this. These are tungsten lights which have fixed color temperatures. They can get very hot. LED lights, which are these, do not get hot. They do not overheat. They draw much less power, and they're much more energy efficient, and they have a variable color temperature. And these things right here and this are called barn doors, which control the spread of the light. How direct and focused do you want it? How open and kind of spread out do you want it? And I'll show you in just a second. And again, we'll get to editing a bit, but you're going to actually see a jump cut if this works. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to use my little screen as a example, but here we go. This is an LED light, and you have your collapsible barn doors. Kind of hard for me to do it from this angle. But yeah, this is an LED light. I don't know. I just had it here, so I thought I would show you. I use this when I record these at night because I need extra light, so you can see me. So yeah, I just want to show you that. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of go over lighting fixtures, nothing in depth, but just, keep in mind there are lights meant for this. These are studio lights, and, you're not just using fluorescent lights in a location. Okay, so lighting. Lighting is the amount of light per unit area in a scene. Lighting setup is usually consistent throughout a scene, sometimes only for a shot, sometimes for an entire movie. The only thing I want to mention with this is usually a scene is lit, right? Each scene has its own sort of style of lighting, and when you change locations, that style can change. Exposure lighting, I kind of mentioned this before, is something we can't really see, right? We don't really know how much light it took for them to add to the scene to get an exposed image. But I'll show you what an underexposed shot looks like. So just keep in mind, even for the most basic looking setup, lighting setup, I should clarify, there is still quite a bit of effort put behind the scenes to get you a scene that looks properly lit, if that makes sense. What we're going to be investigating is stylistic lighting. And this is lighting used to contribute to the film. I don't know why I say film. But to be more specific, it's lighting used to sort of act as maybe a bit of thematic commentary, lighting to make it look more aesthetically pleasing, lighting to make it feel maybe more moody or atmospheric, right? It's lighting that we can perceive. I think I'm using that word correctly. So basic lighting terms that I want to get out of the way. And I mentioned a few of these on the last presentation. But when we're talking about lighting, specifically when we're talking about tonal contrast, which I'll talk about in a bit, we're looking at how shadows, highlights, and midtones are used in a lighting setup. Shadows are the darkest parts of the image. Subjects carry little light. Usually what we see is like sort of the black in an image is a shadow, while the sort of whites or the hot spots are highlights. So again, shadows are just the darkest parts of the image. Highlights, these are the lightest / brightest parts of the image. Subjects carry the most light. Midtones is everything in between shadows and highlights. So we looked at the black and white photography example last module, and we were talking about how like the blacks in the image were the shadows, the bright whites, like her hair rim light, were the highlights, and then everything else was sort of living in midtones, right? Her skin, her dress were all gray, and literally gray, right? Because it's black and white. With color, it's going to be a little bit different, but you still want to use the same terminology. If you're investigating a lighting setup, actually talk about what subjects are in shadow, what subjects are in highlights, what subjects live in midtones, and why. This is an exposure range that's often used. Again, you don't have to worry about this, but like when you're doing color correction and fixing exposure, you work with things called lumiscopes, and it basically has a range for your shadows to your highlights from 0 to 100. And your shadows, your deepest shadows, live in 0, while your highlights, the most brightest highlights, live in 100. And everything else is a scale in between. And you can see the sort of bleed through, right? We have black, dark gray, gray, light gray, almost getting into white, but gray. And then we're starting to kind of enter the whites and then the hot whites at the end. And that's 100. And that leads us to tonal contrast. A lot of times people just use the phrase contrast, but that's actually not true. There's tonal contrast, there's color contrast, there's different types. We're only going to talk about tonal and color contrast, but I want you to get this correct. So tonal contrast. Tonal contrast, when we're talking about lighting, is the difference between the shadows and highlights. The range between the drastic range between the darkest parts of the image to the brightest. By manipulating the intensity of the shadows and highlights in an image, excuse me, you can have a larger tonal contrast. So a high tonal contrast is where the image has a broad range of tones. Image will have deep shadows and strong highlights. So a high tonal contrast, you'll be able to see, you know, a strong use of shadows and a deliberate use of shadows. Low tonal contrast is sort of the other end here. The image blends shadows and highlights. The image lives in midtones. There's little strong shadow. Everything sort of looks even in a way. And this is going to sort of link to low key and high key lighting, but I want you to keep this in mind. The idea of a high tonal contrast, we see a huge range between the shadows and the highlights. It's a very sort of dramatic lighting decision. So in this example, we have a high tonal contrast. And, you know, again, because you should be doing this on your own, where are our shadows? What subjects are in shadows? Where's the deepest shadows in the image? And then where are our strongest highlights? Okay, so I'm going to point out a few. So our strong shadows are mostly sort of in the environment, right? Our actual location is strong shadow. In addition to that, to sort of go one step further, we have two human subjects. This human subject is a strong shadow, right? Look how, again, that kind of like deep black for the lighting. So they are in strong shadows. And then if we kind of keep going, we can see there's a huge range between the shadows and the highlights, the darkest parts of the image and the brightest. There's a high tonal contrast. So if this is 0, we have like 80 to 100 on the floor. Look how bright the light is on the floor. His hair light behind him, a little bit back here. So we're seeing there's a high level of brightness of highlights in comparison to the deepest of shadows. Now, if we kind of keep investigating, we also see those midtones, right? We see that kind of mid-range, and that mid-range is this human subject. And again, we see that this is looks like it's using a shallow depth of field. Our foreground is a little soft, and our background is critical, but that's to do with focus. So I hope that makes sense, right? Shadows, shadow, dark shadows, deep shadows, highlights, highlights, highlights. And again, you can maybe read into the image the idea that, you know, maybe this character is somewhere in between with morality, while this character is maybe gone all the way to becoming a bad guy. Or maybe, I'm trying to remember the context of the film, but I'm pretty sure this is an assassin hunting this guy down. So, you know, there's a little bit of a comment there. So this is a lower contrast shot. And, you know, on paper, we're supposed to be living in sort of a dark environment. But if we look at the lighting in comparison to this, the tonal contrast is not nearly as dramatic, right? Instead, we see everything sort of lives in a mid-range. Even the deepest of shadows in the far background, you can still sort of read them on the environment. And the human subjects are also kind of living in that mid-range. So we don't have a really large tonal contrast. And the only highlight that we have is this light beam coming through. So again, think about like the context of this shot. If we're supposed to believe that this is taking place in a completely, you know, limited lighting scenario in this tunnel, and the only source of light is this light, well, clearly that's not reading, right? Instead, they decided to have a lower tonal contrast and let the entire image kind of live in this mid-range of exposure. And we don't have a really dramatic range of shadow to highlight. Now we're dealing with even a lower tonal contrast, so I call this low tonal contrast, where, you know, even in this shot, we have some shadows in the far background, but in this, everything is living in that kind of middle range. The closest shadows that we have are probably like his suit, maybe a little bit here, but for the most part, everything's living in that kind of mid-range. And our highlights aren't even that strong. Look at the lights, right? Those are probably the closest, but even those sort of live in that middle middle range on that scale. So this is a relatively low tonal contrast. There's no large separation of shadow to highlight. So again, just to kind of as a takeaway, if something has a high tonal contrast, there's a large range between shadows and highlights. It's very dramatic. Okay, so as we kind of broke down tonal contrast, let's move into exposure lighting. As I mentioned before, our eyes see much more in low light environments than a camera sensor does. So the lens needs the subject to be lit beyond the eye, just for us to get an exposed image. As a refresher to the previous module, the aperture allows how much light passes the lens into the sensor or to the film stock. It's measured in f-stops. The lower the f-stop, the more light's going to be coming through. The higher the f-stop, the less light. For dark settings, director photographers may utilize large lighting rigs in order to properly expose the camera. And this is sort of what I was mentioning before. We don't even notice that, right? To us, it just looks like, well, that's kind of what a city street would look like at night. But in reality, the cinematographer and their lighting crew have to set up a large lighting rig just to get enough light to expose the image. So exposure lighting is just a base need for photography that we rarely sort of recognize, but I just want you to understand that even for the sort of most basic lighting setups, there's a lot of strategic lighting going on. This is just another aperture ring. I already showed you this before. But this is our example of exposure lighting. So if our scene is this crashed car, notice this really elaborate lighting setup here, which again is sort of using a giant softbox for the light that's inside. But look at how much light it's actually casting onto the subjects. And again, this is just used not for anything necessarily stylistic, but just to get an exposed image. Okay, some more things with exposure lighting. I talked a little bit about the difference between gain and grain. So this is true, I guess, for film as well, but mostly for digital cameras, you can manipulate the ISO or gain. When lighting rigs are not available, director photographers may utilize ISO/gain settings on their cameras. A lot of cameras have minimum ISO settings where like you have to have a 500 ISO to record anything. But they have a range, so you can have a higher ISO if you're dealing with a lower light situation. So ISO/gain allows the sensor of the camera to be more sensitive to the light beyond the limits of the aperture. So again, if you're increasing the ISO or the gain on a camera, you're amplifying the video signal. And again, the only time this is going to happen is if you're dealing with an extremely low light situation where you cannot bring in additional lights. However, if you go too far, you can actually start to damage the image. So ISO/gain side effects. If too much gain is added to an image in a low light situation, the image may lessen in quality and contain artifacts. You receive a grainy/noisy image, which looks much more different than the sort of nice grain that we were seeing in those film stock examples. It looks something like this. So this is what happens when you have an underexposed image and you are trying to get anything on the camera. And now we are increasing the ISO and the gain so much that we're disrupting the video signal. And you get all this corruption of the video signal, and it fragments the pixels, right? And you can see that it's beyond that idea of grain. Okay, so now let's get into the features of lighting. I'm going to talk about 3-point lighting, which is a very sort of basic lighting setup. Then we're going to get into lighting quality, the difference between hard and soft lighting. Then we're going to talk about high key versus low key lighting. Okay. So 3-point lighting. 3-point lighting is a tried and true lighting practice. It's usually how a lighting setup for a scene starts. Director of photography often use 3-point lighting as a base and work from there, moving lights further or closer to the subject, adding, removing lights, or softening lights. 3-point lighting is something that's been used for a long time to reach that proper level of exposure for a scene, but also we see the sort of the foundations of 3-point lighting carrying through to a lot of different lighting setups. So I'm going to talk about the key light, fill light, and the backlight. And even if the scene isn't using 3-point lighting, we'll kind of harken back to that setup where there usually is like a strong key, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the key light, this is the most intense light and primary source of illumination. It's aimed at the subject of the scene. And a lot of lighting setups will sort of show you the key light. And it'll do so with a practical source in the frame. And it's just going to sort of simulate that and say, hey, this is the strongest light source. And then the lighting design kind of takes that reference. The fill light is a soft light that fills in the shadows left over from the key light. And the backlight separates the subject from the background. We'll talk about silhouette effect in a little bit. Okay, so here is our 3-point lighting. Oops, there we go. And this is sort of like an interview setup, which is for like documentaries. Almost every documentary interview or A-roll is shot in 3-point lighting. But this just kind of gives an idea of what it would look like from an overhead. So if this is your camera, this is your subject, your key light, and if you kind of look at the shading of the light, this tells us, hey, this is at like 100% intensity. And that is directly onto our subject. And sometimes that very hard lighting, which we'll get into in a bit, can create sharp shadows on your subject. And I'll show you what happens if you only use a key light and if you position in the right way, the different sort of lighting styles you can get. But often filmmakers don't want that. They want something a little bit more naturalistic. So you add a fill light on the other side of the subject to fill in those leftover shadows. And then you have a backlight behind the subject to give them maybe a little bit of hair light to separate them from the background, especially if it's like a black background. That'll make them kind of pop out more. So this is one of the images that I pulled, and I don't know, frankly, this isn't using just a 3-point lighting, but it gives you an idea of what it would sort of look like in film. So let's pretend this is 3-point lighting, and just by looking at the subject's face, and obviously the arrows kind of hint at it, which arrow do you think is linking to the key light? And I'll just give you a second to think on that. Okay, so my guess would be it's this arrow, right? Notice on her face, and again, using some of our terminology, the highlights on her face is frame right? Clearly the brightest part, and that's the strongest light being cast through. And if that was the only light that was up, you would see a very sort of harsh shadow on the other side of her face. But instead, the cinematographer and the lighting crew said, we need a fill light to sort of fill in some of those shadows. And it's much sort of softer of a lighting style on the frame left. But you see, it's starting to create some sort of, what's what I'm looking for? Not separation, but it's starting to kind of tie the two lighting styles together. And I don't really see much of a backlight, but the arrow is sort of pointing at the back of her jacket. And you can see a little bit of highlights on the back here, but I don't truly believe there's a backlight. Instead, what we're probably seeing is there's quite a bit of overhead lighting going on, because notice the background of the shot of how well lit it is as well. So if you only had, 3 lights set up to light this one subject, you wouldn't be seeing that. But there's definitely a key light being used and a fill light. So I just kind of want you to be able to notice that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a few different lighting styles you can achieve with just a key light. So front lighting is when the single light fixture, if it's a key, so if it's a very strong, intense light, is directed at the upper hemisphere, chest up of the subject, and is placed near the camera. The position of the camera is frontal to the subject. With front lighting, the lighting tends to flatten out the features by illuminating all the surfaces. So again, essentially, I'm just going to show you what front lighting looks like, and to, again, kind of give you an idea when you're breaking down lighting setups. You can say, oh, they're using front lighting here. And again, this isn't exactly, but if we pretend, I'm going to use this diagram later, but if this is our human subject and the lighting fixture is here, in reality, it'll probably be placed like here, and then the camera's like a little bit over here. But just to kind of give you an idea of the organization of lighting fixture, camera. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. In relation to our subject. So front lighting would look something like this. And again, this is the idea that there's no other lights being used, right? We're in a completely dark environment and we set up the lighting fixture to be in front of the subject using a key light, a very strong, intense light that has a hard lighting quality in front of the subject. It creates a look like this. Her face lives in highlights. It even kind of trickles off into her hair. This, again, right, they might be cheating a little bit. There's possibly a backlight here as well because you see sort of the rim light on her hair. The highlights kind of pop out there. But this is a very sort of intense frontal lighting setup. Then we have side lighting. And I'm not going to read over the entire thing here, but side lighting is just if you place the light fixture on a profile. So if the camera is still placed in front of the subject, but then you place the light on the side of them, on either side. So it looks something like this. If our subject is here, our camera is here, we're from a frontal position, which we'll talk about later, and then the light is on a profile, it's on the side. And again, I have it for our next picture that it's positioned here, but it could also be positioned over here. So side lighting. So now I think you'll be able to use this terminology a bit easier. But if we look at this shot and if we talk about the lighting, is this a low or high tonal contrast? Okay, I would say this is a high tonal contrast, right? We're dealing with deep shadows and we're dealing with very bright highlights. There's a large separation between the darkest parts of the image, the shadows, and the brightest, the highlights. And what they're doing here is that key light is just hitting the side of her face, screen right. And we'll talk more about stuff like that later, but it's hitting the screen right of her face. And clearly that's casting it into a shadow. But when you do that and you don't have that fill light, right? You don't have another light hitting this side of the face, or again, the position of the light is from the side too. It creates a separation, right? There's a delineation between highlights and shadows right down the face. And again, you'll see styles like this. So if you see something like this, make sure you know that it's a style of side lighting. Okay, so now we're going to talk about using lights from behind. And again, this is still the idea of just using one key light in a lighting setup. Excuse me. Again, I'm not going to really read all of these, but consider if our camera is still in a frontal position, but now we move that key light to behind the subject. So our camera is here, our subject is looking at the camera, then you place that one key light behind the subject. It looks something like this. And this is, I'll talk more about silhouette in a bit, but this creates that sort of silhouette effect where, we're dealing again with a high tonal contrast, but shadows are certainly sort of dominating the image, right? We're dealing with a lot of shadows in the shot. shadow, shadows, shadows, shadows. And the only highlights spill over from, what the subject isn't blocking. So we have some highlights on the shoulders, highlights on the hair, on the rims of the hat a little bit. So again, we're dealing with a large tonal contrast. I'm sorry, a high tonal contrast. And we're seeing shadows on his face, on his shirt. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is this is similar to a silhouette effect. A silhouette effect just means that like the human subject is a shadow, right? They sort of look like a living shadow. But I'll show you some other examples of that. And rarely would you actually use backlighting for that effect. We'll talk about that. Okay. So a couple more things you could do with just the key light. You could do something called top lighting, under lighting. That's all I'll mention because I don't have pictures for those. And you'll probably not see those too often. Okay, so silhouette effect. You don't have to worry about the details of this. But the only thing I want to mention is the way it's done in a film usually is if the subject is standing in front of a very bright source. And what the cinematographer or camera operator will do is they lower their aperture to properly expose that very bright source in the background, which then throws the human subject in the foreground into shadow. So you basically underexpose the human subject in relation to that bright source. And it creates a silhouette effect. And the silhouette effect is, again, is this idea of this sort of like, and it's not always a human, but a thing becomes a shadow, like a living shadow in the frame. And I'll show you what that looks like. So here's a silhouette effect. And again, this is sort of a pretty highly manipulated one. This is from like a photograph, and I'm going to show you a still frame from a movie, which will make it, I think, what's what I'm looking for? More true. I don't know, right? This is clearly there's probably some Photoshop going on here, but this really is a clear example. So our human subject is in the foreground and they're standing in front of the sun. And now the cinematographer, or the photographer in this case, is adjusting the aperture so that the human subject gets thrown into shadow, right? They underexpose the human subject to properly expose that brightest source. So, if they did it vice versa, the image would actually look sort of overexposed. But by doing that, you place the darker subject in complete shadow. And again, we have another sort of high tonal contrast with here, obviously the highlights, and then our human subject lives in shadow. This is from a film. This is from Skyfall, but this is another silhouette example. So you have the burning house in the background of the shot, and then you have your villain, Javier Bardem's character, in the foreground. And as they're standing in front of that, very obviously strong highlight, a lot of light, the cinematographer properly, exposes for that very bright source. And because there's a separation between the human subject and the bright source, it throws the human subject into complete shadow. So again, whenever you see something like this idea of a subject in complete shadow like that, outside of everything else that's properly lit, it's a silhouette effect. Okay, I also want to talk about accent lighting. Most of the time when we're talking about lighting, you're usually focusing on how the light hits a subject, and usually that subject is the person, right? The actor in the scene, the character in the scene. But there's also a lot of lighting design that goes into the set or the location, and that's accent lighting. So after lighting your subjects, also try to make the background as interesting as possible with some accent lighting, placing light on specific areas of the set/location to contribute to the ambiance/atmosphere of the scene. So I'm just going to place that again. Accent lighting is when you specifically light parts of the set or the location or props, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So position a light on a specific surface or object in the scene. Lighting beyond the subject, often in the background, I don't know why I have that note, but yeah, a lot of times it's like a light spilling on walls. So the next example, where's the light stationed on the background? And I think my next photo here is like a sort of like a studio um, photograph session. But this is a pretty good example of accent lighting. So where is the accent light? What is the accent light on? Okay, so I'm gonna step in. My wrist is kind of bothering with the mouse. Okay, so the accent lighting is on the background, right? It's on this background fabric. And you can see it's clearly stationed, behind the subject and sort of below and tilted up to kind of just give us a highlight on the background. And that light is only positioned on this kind of background sheet. In addition to that, obviously, there's other lighting being used as well, just like I mentioned. Usually the lighting is for the subject. So clearly she's also lit with what looks to be sort of like a 3-point lighting setup. You can see the key light, right? We see some highlights here, and then you have a fill light with a little bit of shadow left over. So again, you're seeing a key light being used, you're seeing a fill light being used, and you're seeing an accent light being used in the background there. This is from a film. This is from Suspiria, and this is another example. So we're seeing accent lighting on the walls, this like red color temperature. So there's red light on the walls, on the headboard here, on the window. So that's all accent lighting. But beyond that, and again, we're going to talk about color contrast in just a bit, but if you compare the color of that light to the color light that's actually lighting the human subjects, that's a white light. So we have accent lighting, and the human subjects are being lit with, a white light. So yeah. Okay, so now we're going to talk about lighting quality. Lighting quality is the type of light featured in a shot/scene, hard or soft lighting. Lighting quantity is the amount of light that's used in a scene. Most lighting setups combine hard and soft lighting. So right now, the only thing you need to kind of focus on is lighting quality. And I'm going to talk about the difference between hard and soft lighting, and you'll see how these sort of fold into either using a high tonal contrast or a low tonal contrast. So hard lighting. Hard lighting is strong and focused. It is very direct on the subject. When it's used in a low-key setup, a hard light will create a highlight in the image and create a well-defined dark shadows around that highlight. Again, highlights are the brightest part of a photograph subject. So again, hard lighting is also sort of synonymous with using a key light. It just creates that very sort of sharp, focused, direct, bright light, which draws the highlight in the image. Characteristics of hard lighting, again, it's dark, it's direct, it's sharp, and it highlights the subject. It highlights the subject usually out of shadows. So this is an example here. We have hard lighting. That's also a low-key lighting setup, which I'll talk about later, and a high tonal contrast. So again, using our terminology, shadows, some shadows on this side of the face, and the key light, we don't know exactly where it's coming from, but it's probably coming from off screen, like over here. And that key light is very sharp, direct onto James Bond's face, creating highlights on his face, separating him out from the shadows with a little bit of spillover over here. So this is a very hard, sharp, direct lighting. And notice it's not very naturalistic, right? This isn't something we usually see in every day, which we'll see with soft lighting. So soft lighting is diffused and spread out. The light source is scattered and it sort of wraps around the subject. So yeah, it seems to wrap around subjects, and strong shadows are usually not present. When this lighting quality is used, it reduces definition of the subject. The subject, instead of sort of popping out from, say, the shadows, they kind of blend. Again, it kind of gives us that sort of mid-tone look. Diffusion material like tough spun is added to the light to soften it, and also it may be stationed further away from the subject. Again, since I have my props here, I'll use it anyway. But here I use this little desk lamp with some diffusion material in front of it to soften it. There we go. So that creates a softer light. It's not as focused and direct and sharp and harsh. And again, to soften it, you can either just literally remove the light away from the subject. Let me rephrase that. Back the light away from the subject to create more distance and have a higher sort of fall off of the light rays, or add diffusion material like tough spun. The characteristics of soft lighting is that it's soft, it's scattered, it's pleasant. It's also naturalistic and again, just not as cinematic or even artificial. It looks, I don't know. We'll see an example of it. There we go, soft lighting. So here's soft lighting, right? Again, we're dealing with a dark environment. It's kind of like the James Bond example, but compare and contrast, right? So now we're living more in that sort of mid-tone range. Obviously, there are highlights. The highlights are, the light coming through the background here. But if we focus on our human subject, again, we have some shadow on their face, but it's not nearly as drastic as this, right? And if you even focus on the sort of sharpness of the highlights in comparison, notice how that light sort of just wraps around the entire subject. And there's really only one sort of highlight on his head is right there. For the most part, everything's sort of just living in those sort of midtones. And it's not direct and sharp and critical and really sticking him out from the shadows. There's more of a sort of a blending of the tonal contrast. Whoops. Okay. So now we're going to start linking some of these together. There's high key and low key lighting. With high key lighting, everything in the frame is evenly lit. It's also usually very brightly lit. It creates a neutral look. Viewers can see all details in the frame. This lighting technique is often used in comedy and sitcoms. It's the idea of lighting as a blanket. There's no real direction or shape of light or shadow. It was originally conceived to make shoots more efficient, usually used in order to contribute an upbeat atmosphere. There's a low tonal contrast. So again, always keep in mind the tonal contrast thing, but also that sort of that idea of range, where this sort of lives in those sort of like middle grays. High key lives more towards like the higher grays and whites, right? It's very sort of bright as well. So here's high key. Notice we can see everything very cleanly throughout the frame. There's almost no shadows whatsoever, right? Everything is living in either upper mid-tones to highlights. There's maybe a little bit of shadow here. For the most part, our human subjects are highlights, and then also the background is even kind of pushing it further up, right? This is sort of living in that kind of white, bright light. Here's another high key example. Again, both foreground and background are living in that kind of high tonal, that high range on the tonal contrast. Again, we're dealing with a low tonal contrast. I know some of this stuff is confusing, but it's a low tonal contrast. We don't have deep shadows through the lighting. Everything is very brightly lit and evenly lit. Again, almost no shadows whatsoever in this setup. This is a high key example for a black and white film. Again, mostly living in those highlights, low tonal contrast. And then the only other thing I kind of want to mention is when a filmmaker is using a high key lighting setup, there's really no strategy to the light, right? This is the idea of lighting being used as a blanket. It's not like we're casting certain things in shadow. We're not defining subjects out of shadows. This, not to downplay this, but it takes less effort than a very designed low-key lighting setup. Okay, so now let's talk about low-key. So low-key lighting setups offer a high tonal contrast between light and dark, a high tonal contrast between shadow and highlights. It's a separation from the lightest part of the image and the darkest. So again, a high tonal contrast, separation from large dramatic separation of shadow to highlights. The lighting is not even. There's a clash of light and dark. It offers a distinct cinematic quality. right? We rarely see low-key lighting in our everyday. You get deep shadows and you get bright highlights. This also creates distinct shadows. And when a low-key setup is being used, it takes a lot of effort to pull it off. So think about, why are the shadows on this subject? Why are the highlights on this subject? What's the shape of the shadows? What's the direction of the light? How is the light sculpting the subject out from shadows? Are there shafts of light? Are the shafts of light kind of linking to the idea of like a strong key light? And again, usually with a low key, you're using a hard lighting quality. So here we go with our low key setup here. Again, a high tonal contrast, right? The highlights are on frame left of our subject's face. And then frame right, we have deep shadows. So we're dealing with a high tonal contrast. And again, you could probably guess we're using a key light from probably right about here-ish, maybe even a little bit further off, but a strong key light being cast without any sort of fill light to fill in the shadows that are left over. There's a bit of side lighting going on here that trickles off also on his costume. So this is low key. And then the shadows obviously are also in the background of the shot too. Another thing to point out is we'll talk about color temperature in a bit, but notice the color of the light. This is tungsten. It's a warmer kind of golden hue to the color of the light. Here's another low-key example. So again, just kind of connecting things back together. We have strong highlights, and then we have strong shadows. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. What's the lighting effect that our subject is in? Silhouette. And our subject is really the shadow, right? He is the deepest shadow in the frame while we have our highlights coming through from the window. And we're also seeing shafts of light coming through the window too, which you don't see in a high key lighting setup, right? You need a low key setup to have that high tonal contrast so you can actually see how these shafts of light come through the shadows. Another thing that a lot of filmmakers use are patterns. Cucoloris or cookies are essentially just patterns that are cut out and you place in front of a light fixture. And what will happen is if you're lighting it correctly, you can create a pattern out of the light, right? The shadows have a pattern from the light, and this sort of simulates like a light, like blinds, light blinds. I think I'm using that right. But like, you know, light coming through blinds on a window to create this pattern. Okay, so let's also talk about color temperature, which we'll circle back to with color palette. But I want to introduce it now because sometimes I feel like I confuse students if I don't, and I understand why, right? There's a lot of content. But color temperature, to be very clear, all light also has its own color. Again, we're sort of used to like fluorescent lights, so you know we see that color a lot, but light has a range of color, and that's color temperature. So color temperature is the color of light present in a shot. And many times, filmmakers can use a variety of color temperatures within a shot. So then you have color contrast. Color temperature is measured in Kelvin. The higher the Kelvin, the lower the Kelvin, the warmer the colors. The higher the Kelvin, the cooler the colors, which eventually reach sort of like a blue light at the end of the scale. Some major color temperatures, we have tungsten. Tungsten is that warm, yellowish, candle-like light. That's 3200 K. That's tungsten. Natural or daylight is that sort of white light, which lives at 5500 K. And then I have this third category that sort of fits somewhere sort of outside of the typical Kelvin temperature, but just the use of color lights. So again, you can just say things like they're using a blue light, a purple light, a red light, a green light. So just anything that sort of fits outside of that typical scale. So like, you know, blues, purples, reds, greens. Usually they're motivated by like a neon light in the frame, and then the cinematographer supplements that with another light fixture. To achieve these, very dramatic colors, the lighting fixture might have a bulb that's actually painted in a way, or they use gels that they place in front of the lighting fixtures to project that color. So here's our color temperature chart. And again, I'll go back to this again when we get to color palette, but I'm just introducing it now. But you can see this is the Kelvin chart. So down to 1,000, you're dealing almost in like reds. And then the higher you go, you reach into blues, right? It's just a range of hues of colors from very warm to very cool. And then white kind of lives in the middle. Excuse me. And again, I'll show these again, but just very quickly, here's our tungsten light. To be very clear, she is not being lit by this candle, right? This is, we'll talk about this in a second, but this is the practical source, or the source that's being simulated from the cinematographer. And instead what we're getting is that sort of side lighting effect. And this is a little bit different because the camera position is profile. So it's possible that we're getting sort of like front lighting, right? And we're just not seeing the other side of her face. But we're getting that effect where, screen left of her face is highlight, screen right is shadow, and she's coming out from that. But right now, just focus on the color of the light. This is that yellowish golden hue. And then obviously the brightest parts of it kind of dip into white on the face. This is more of a natural or daylight color temperature, that kind of white light. And then here's our color lights, right? We see red. Red is sort of the primary source here, but it's really the same effect of having highlights and shadow, right? The only difference is they're using a red light. So again, color of the light is color temperature. And then this is kind of what I was talking about before, but using a mix of color temperatures creates a color contrast. And this is strictly through lighting, right? There's no props or production design that's offering this. This is strictly through using different light fixtures with different color temperatures. So we have a red light on frame left. We have a purple light on the back of this subject. We have a blue light on the back of this subject on the wall here. You have kind of a golden lights coming through as well. So you have a range of colors. So again, tonal contrast is dealing with levels of exposure, shadows, and highlights and midtones. Color contrast is we're seeing a variety of different colors in the lighting setup for the shot. Okay. Lighting styles. This is just, frankly, I don't really know why I use this term, but I think it kind of helps us separate different styles. These are very sort of broad categories, but lighting styles is a style of lighting setup for a scene, how the director of photography utilizes the elements of lighting in order to create a look through the lighting. Lighting to contribute to mood, interest, aesthetic quality, and motive. There are two extreme styles, and again, we'll get to this with like realist and formalist, but often it fits on a scale. So a lighting style can be very naturalistic and try to mimic everyday life, or it can be pretty expressionistic and be very overly dramatic and kind of harken back to German expressionism. So naturalistic is when lighting will generally follow the logistical scheme of the natural light sources within the scene. So the idea of simulating natural sources that we see within the frame. This can range from seeing windows, lamps, candles, and then the lighting setup. We just sort of build on top of that. So director photographies will take reference of the natural sources in a given shot and then supplement those sources with additional lighting. So you're simulating natural sources. There's a practical source in the frame, and that tells the viewer, hey, that's where the lighting's coming from. And then the style of the lighting setup sort of just mimics that. So in this next picture, I'm going to ask, what is the natural source? And then think about, again, know that that source is not lighting the scene. There is additional lighting going on. But does the intensity and hard light direction of that source tell us there's an added light there? So this is pretty easy, but what is the natural source? okay? I'm going to say it's the window, right? This open window is telling us that, hey, this is where we're getting the light in the scene. And essentially it's acting as a key light, right? That light is shining through the window as the strongest light in the scene. We can see the kind of shaft of light coming through. But clearly the cinematographer, Ernest Dickerson, is building on this source. So he probably has this like huge panel outside that's giving us this look. In addition to that, within the scene, there's probably additional lights to kind of give us more levels of exposure in the scene. But we're simulating this natural source. Okay, naturalistic lighting setups are generally meant to mimic everyday life. It's often used when a director of photography aims for a realistic look. DOPs may choose to only use available light. This means that they are not supplementing the light present in a scene, specifically for on-location shooting, and only using available light. This is often used when filming outdoors. So that's something that's big with like digital cinema. Again, you're able to shoot in lower light environments, and some cinematographers push to use only available light. I'm going to show you a picture from Barry Lyndon. So this is a naturalistic style, right? So even though we're simulating sources, the idea of just having a window and just, you know, natural daylight coming through, if you compare this to this is much more dramatic, right? And again, on that scale, it's kind of tipping to expressionistic. It's quite exaggerated, and it creates a very sort of cinematic lighting style, even though we're simulating the natural source. But if you compare it to something like this, that's, you know, a much more sort of flatter, directionless lighting style. Famously, Barry Lyndon only shot with available light. So that's kind of why you're kind of getting this. It's very naturalistic, but there's also no real shape or direction to the light. Then on the other end of the scale, we have expressionistic. So this is a highly stylized lighting setup that does not ask the viewer to believe that the lighting is occurring within the scene. The lighting doesn't exist in the day-to-day. Director of photography may still take reference of natural sources, but greatly exaggerate them. Or this lighting style can have no context to natural sources. So something like this, we're dealing with a very sort of exaggerated color temperature, right? That very bright red, which we don't see in everyday life. We also have no source of where that red light is coming from. So this kind of dips into that expressionistic lighting. So some notes on styles. Films rarely rely on one style throughout. The style can change in any given scene or given shot. The definition of these styles are fluid. So for example, the shot from Do the Right Thing with the strong light coming out from the window, that's somewhere between expressionistic and naturalistic. When describing lighting setups, you may use several styles. It's more important to point out the features of lighting. So let me park on that for a second. I'd much rather you talk about how shadows are used strategically or highlights are used strategically or where the light's coming from and why you think the cinematographer and director are placing this subject in shadows while this subject is in highlights, or creating a high tonal contrast to create a separation. What's the thematic meaning behind that? Pointing out color temperatures being used, right? I'd rather you focus stuff on that than saying, yeah, this is somewhat expressionistic with a bit of naturalistic. Don't really worry about that. Just think of that as sort of like a jumping off point. Okay, so I talked already about sources, but just to kind of clean that up, if you're talking about the source or the practical source, that just means where in the frame is the light coming from? Do we see a light source in the frame? Is it a practical source like a nearby lamp, or is the light coming from somewhere out of frame, an artificial source, which usually tells us an expressionistic lighting? Direction is what is the light choosing to focus on? What is left in the shadows and why? What is the shape of the light? Is it scattered? Is it direct? Is the light creating a pattern out of the shadows? Are they using a glorious? Are they using different lighting styles like a key that's front, back, or side lighting? So let's do a little lighting activity to break down the lighting setups. And as I show you, again, this is just one frame from a shot. focus on just pulling out the characteristics of lighting. So talking about tonal contrast, color temperatures, the shape, the direction, different lighting effects. What are the highlights? What are the shadows? Why do you think they chose that? What's the quality of the light? Is it naturalistic? Is it expressionistic? And additionally, how is the lighting making you feel? Again, these lighting setups I'm about to show you are not high key, right? They're not blanket lighting. This is very strategic lighting that takes a lot of time to pin down. So think about why filmmakers are going through this effort. All right, so I'm going to park on this for a second without saying anything, but think about what's the color temperature, what's the tonal contrast, where are the shadows, where are the highlights, what's the shape of the light, what's the shape of the shadows, is there accent lighting going on? I just kind of have inner commentary on the lighting in this one shot. Okay, so a couple seconds and okay, so I'm going to talk about it. So let's look at this. We're dealing with one primary color temperature, blue, just a blue light. And it seems like it's coming from some off-screen source that's probably like a projector in the movie. Again, we're not seeing the whole scene, seeing that kind of out of context. But that's clearly creating a key, right? We have a very sharp highlight coming from that source. So it's providing this key light that provides a silhouette effect on our male subject. He's in complete shadow. So we have a silhouette effect here. And then it's coming through onto the female subject. And she is not in silhouette, but the entire scene, we're dealing with a high tonal contrast, and it's in a low key lighting setup because we're dealing with very strong shadows and very strong highlights. There's a large separation, but she lives obviously further in that sort of almost into, she's still very much in shadow, but not as much as our male subject, right? She's sort of living towards the sort of midtones. So we kind of have like a bit of front lighting going on here, highlights a bit on the face, but again, a lot of her is draped in shadow. Then if we kind of go one step further, we can see there's some accent lighting going on, right? There's some accent lighting going on in the background of the shot on the blinds here, which again is still living that kind of blue color temperature. And in addition to that, there's even some sort of atmosphere in the lighting, right? The use of smoke, both from her cigarette, but also the scene itself clearly has a little bit of smoke in the scene. And it gives that lighting a little bit more of a texture in the shot. All right. So again, I use this, I'm not going to read this, but if you ever need sort of review on things that I'm looking for when you're breaking down the lighting in a shot, this is kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read that all, but you can use that as a reference. So here's another example, and let's talk about this for a second. So reflect. Okay, so I'm going to jump in here. So here we're dealing with a color temperature that's, more of like that daylight white light. And if you compare this quality of light to this, we're dealing with a much softer light. I don't know if I would necessarily call this low key, right? This is not, it's definitely not high key, but if you look at the shadows, they're not pitch black, right? It's not a deep shadow. Excuse me. We had that side lighting effect going on, but because the light quality is already quite soft and it's scattered on her face, the highlights aren't super bright, right? This side of her face aren't super bright, and then the shadows aren't super dark. So it's kind of that in between. It's not quite low key, it's not quite high key. When what else do we want to say about here? So we said it's a white color temperature, soft light. The highlights are on the right side of her face. The shadows are on the, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. The highlights are on the frame right. Shadows are on frame left. So I think that's about it. And again, in the back of your head, also start thinking about feelings. Compare how you're feeling in this shot with the lighting to this shot. This is maybe a little more expressionistic, maybe a little sinister, moody, atmospheric. Think about why. What if I told you this shot is from a vampire movie called The Hunger? And this character is a vampire and she doesn't know he's a vampire. Okay, how is the lighting now expressionistic from that choice? Okay, here's another one, and I might not do all of them. I think I have a couple more after this. But here's another example. Here we're dealing with low key or high key. I would say low key, because now we do have a very large tonal contrast. Compare the shadows, right? The kind of backgrounds of the shot are very deep black, while the highlights are bright and, you know, leaning towards white. We have a high tonal contrast. And our color temperature isn't quite tungsten, right? Again, we're kind of dealing with that kind of white light. Excuse me. And so far, all three of our shots have had a limited color contrast, right? Either blue, white, white. And we're seeing the highlights is the piano. Highlights are on the faces of our subjects, and then shadows are kind of in the background here. Here's another example. Again, is this lower high? I'm sorry, let me rephrase this. This is lower high key lighting. I'm gonna go, it's low key. We are dealing with that kind of tungsten color temperature. Shadows are on our subjects, a bit of side lighting going on here as well, where we get that kind of warm color temperature of highlights on the frame left of this subject's face as the frame right kind of dips in shadow. And now if we kind of even look on this side, we are actually getting a little bit of a color contrast. Whoops. So we have tungsten, but we also have a little bit of that white daylight coming from, it looks like maybe a bit of a backlight that's coming through, just a little bit on this subject and a little bit on that subject. So keep that in mind. And again, we haven't seen any color contrast, but yeah. Okay, so that's lighting. So I promise you the other elements of cinematography won't be as in-depth. I'm timing myself as I go, and I'm trying to keep this entire presentation under a class period, right? A typical class period is 2 hours and 50 minutes if we meet once a week. So that's my max for this. But we just talked about lighting for about an hour. There's a reason why we did. So again, keep those features of lighting in mind and make sure you properly talk about lighting, not just saying, hey, this is low key, this is high key. Go that extra step. All right, so now we're in our second element of cinematography, which is the setup. For every setup, there are 3 elements: angles, camera position, shot scales. And remember, every shot is a recorded setup. Okay. So again, a setup is what makes up a shot. As soon as the operator hits record on the camera, that setup becomes a shot. So camera angles. This section I think is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But it's important to understand how to label a setup. I'm sorry, how to label a shot as a setup. So angles. Angles are how the camera is angled towards the subject. Another way of saying an angle is people often say it's the height of the camera, which is true, but don't get that confused, because you can have a camera that's quite low to the ground and it's still a neutral angle. So the way I define it is how the camera is angled towards the subject. So you have a neutral angle. This is where the camera is about eye level with the subject. High angle is when the camera looks down at the subject. The subject is below the camera. Low angle, the camera looks up at the subject is above the camera. And then for a neutral, high or low angle, you can also have variations of basically the balance of the camera. And at times, cinematographers will purposely make the framing crooked. So you can have a low, high, or neutral angle, and then each one of those could also be a Dutch or a canted angle, where the frame is purposely crooked. So this is kind of a somewhat goofy graphic, but I think it explains it quite well. You have this introduces a top angle, which you'll rarely see, but sometimes you'll see like an overhead angle like this. But either you have a camera angle, and imagine this is your subject, like this is their nose, let's say. So a high angle is coming from above and looking down at them. A neutral angle or eye level is, again, eye level. Low angle stationed below and tilted up at them. So here we have a neutral angle. And again, I'm not going to, just for sake of time, I'm not going to do this all the time, but remember, every shot has five elements of cinematography. So as I'm just pulling these frames to show you angles, in the back of your head, maybe think about the lighting in these as well. Okay. High angle, we're stationed above the subjects, looking down at them. Low angle, camera stationed below the subject and is sort of tilted up towards them. They tower over the frame. Then we have a canted angle, and in addition, this is a neutral angle, right? This is a neutral angle, this is a neutral angle that's canted, purposely crooked. Or Dutch, you could also say a Dutch angle. All right, so that was camera angles. I know it's fast, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Then we have camera position. And I don't want to get camera position, I don't want it to get too confusing. So I might kind of skip a few things, but we'll see. So camera position. So this diagram, I think, is a decent introduction. So once you have your angle picked out, you can also choose where you actually want to place the camera in relation to your subject. So think about like this as a range. You can have your camera positioned here. You can have it positioned here. You can have it positioned here, 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 anywhere on this arc. And you could even keep going, right? You can choose any position. And I'll introduce another diagram that I think kind of explains it better. So camera position. It's where you physically place your camera in relation to your subject. Doesn't matter which subject it is. And think back on that kind of circle diagram of the 360 degrees. You know, a cinematographer and director can choose wherever they want of where to place that camera on that diagram. So I'm going to talk about that diagram next. So again, think about if we're dealing with just one subject, this is our subject, this is their nose, and they're in a scene, they're in a location. We can choose to say, hey, we want to place the camera here, 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 any one of these increments. It doesn't matter, right? You can position it wherever you want in a scene. Usually in movies, you see a camera position frontal, which is usually about here, or 3/4 frontal in relation to the subject. But keep in mind, you can place it wherever. Okay, so keeping that in mind, pretend like there's a circle around your subject. Choose any degree from that circle to, don't really worry about this. But some things to kind of introduce is the 30-degree rule, change in shot scale, and 180-degree rule. So 30-degree rule is if you're filming the same subject and you want to sort of get another setup to cover that subject, you need to move the camera 30 degrees at least in position to make that new shot different enough. So when you cut it together, it doesn't seem like a jump cut. You can also change the shot scale drastically. And then this is also part of the 180-degree rule. We'll go back to 180-degree rule later, so don't really worry about that now. Okay, I'm going to do this quickly because, again, we'll come back to this with shooting dialogue scenes, but keep this in mind for a 30-degree rule. So if this is our first setup, Batman on his motorcycle, semi-truck over here. Our first camera position, if you're thinking about that 360-degree diagram, and I'll show you it again, but this is probably coming from like that 30 to 40 degrees on this side. Whoops. Well, I was wrong about that. I don't know if this is necessarily true. Right, I would actually probably place the camera about here-ish. But that's what we're seeing. It's sort of that 3/4 rear of Batman. Now, in the next shot, we are going to see quite a change. Okay, this is the next shot in the sequence. If you watch this, like actually, this edited scene. And now the camera position has changed quite drastically, right? We went from this to this. And this is that idea of the 30-degree rule. If you're going to introduce a new shot in the sequence, it needs to be quite different, especially if it's from the same subject. So we're moving the position drastically. Now we're in this sort of like 3/4 frontal. And if we look at our diagram, it's something like that. Okay, so back to back, 3/4 rear. Now, if you're going to shoot another shot of that subject, you better move that camera pretty far of a pitch in position, and we get this 3/4 frontal. So again, this is the 30-degree rule in effect. Don't worry about it too much. But if you're watching a movie, you'll notice if you're going to see a new shot of that same subject back to back, that new camera position is going to move at least 30 degrees. Okay, yes, we'll come back to 180-degree rule. Okay, this is more important, okay? So when I'm asking you for camera position, it can also be referred to as camera direction, but for us, we're gonna just go with position. So literally placing the camera in relation to the subject, you'll have a front shot, profile shot, or rear shot. And then each one of these have 3/4 variants. So you can have a 3/4 frontal shot or a 3/4 rear shot. You can also have 3/4 profile shots, which we'll kind of see. So here we go. This is a front shot, right? The camera is positioned directly in front of the subject. And if we think about our diagram, it's kind of placed on that 0, right? I'll show you that. So this is a front shot. And again, this is for camera position. So front shot looks something like that. 3/4 frontal. So again, we're not directly in front of the subject. We're kind of on the side of them, but not totally. We're not in profile, but it's somewhere between that frontal and profile. So here we have a 3/4 frontal. So we kind of see the side of their face in relation to the front of their face. And it looks something like that on the diagram. Then we have a profile shot. So now the camera is actually on the side of the subject. And when we have something like that, it's a profile. We're not seeing the front of their face. So instead of playing the camera in front, we're picking it up, moving it over to the side of them, and getting that profile view. And again, I'm not going to spend time to sort of keep going back to things, but keep in mind what maybe you're seeing in lighting and how camera position can influence the lighting. Okay. So that's kind of what it looks like in our diagram. Then we have a rear shot. So now the camera, pick up the camera, place it behind your subject, rear shot. And that's kind of what it looks like on the diagram. So here we have, I'll talk about this later on, but this is a 2-shot. You have 2 subjects in the frame, Jennifer Aniston's character, John C. Reilly's character. And what we're seeing here is a 3/4 frontal on Jennifer Aniston, and we're seeing a 3/4 rear on John C. Reilly. Right? You see a little bit of the side of his face, but we're also kind of coming from behind him. Excuse me. Whoops, and it looks something like that. Again, really all you need when I'm asking you to break down a setup, again, angle, position, shot scale, is the setup. I just want you to note if the position is frontal, 3/4 frontal, profile, 3/4 rear, or rear. So this diagram, I think it's a little silly, but it explains it pretty well. So if you're seeing the shot and it looks like this, frontal, like this, 3/4 frontal, that profile, 3/4 rear, rear, right? If that 360-degree diagram is confusing, don't worry about it. You never have to say, yeah, I think that's like 40 degrees. Don't worry about that, right? I just want to know frontal, 3/4 frontal, profile, 3/4 rear, or rear. All right, so now we're moving into shot scales. Shot scales is related to how much of the subject we see in the frame. How tight is the framing? This is also in relation to proximity of camera. How close for us, for the viewer, does it seem like we are to the subject? And this diagram is a pretty decent example. The frame itself right now, what we're in is it's a wide shot. There's a bunch of different shot scales. We're only going to deal with wide, medium, or close. So we're dealing with a wide shot. We have a lot of space in the frame. We see the location and we see the subject from head to toe. So it's a wide shot. That being said, if you kind of look at this and you look at this border right here, if you pretend like we kind of crop into this, and now this is the entire frame, and all we see is our subject from waist up, and we see just only a little bit of the location in relation to them. There's sort of like within the frame, sort of an equal ratio of the setting and the human subject, but we don't get a full context of the location. That's a medium. Then you get tighter and tighter, and now you're mostly focused on just the human subject, and it's a close-up. But again, we're going to go over plenty of examples here. So again, shot scales is in relation to proxemics. So this refers to the distance between the subject and camera. And to be clear, it's the perceived difference. You can shoot a close-up with a tight enough lens from 30 feet away from your subject. Well, we don't know, so don't worry about that. But it's just how we see the distance between the subject and the camera. There are 3 essential shot scales. Again, don't get this confused. I probably shouldn't use that term. I'm going to take my thing and just cross that out right now. There are 3 essential shot scales, okay? Again, camera positions is something else. Camera positions, we're talking frontal, 3/4 frontal, profile, 3/4 rear, rear. But there are 3 essential shot scales: wide shot, medium shot, close up. Sometimes you'll see people use different terms for wide shots. You'll see terms like full shot, long shot, establishing shot. For us, just use wide shot. I want us to use just the same terminology. So you just say wide shot, medium shot, close up, and then each one of these can have variations. So you can have a close up, but if you have an extreme close up, it's something even tighter. So like I'll show you examples, but an extreme close up would be like a pair of eyes from a face. That's an extreme close up. And a lot of framing kind of lives in between. So like you'll have a close up that's also maybe kind of looks like a medium, right? It's not quite a medium. Maybe we're not waist up, but maybe we're like sort of like mid chest up. And that could maybe be like a medium close up, right? Again, some of these can be kind of fluid. Okay. So wide shot. A wide shot is any shot that, well, let me erase my drawing here. A wide shot, abbreviated as WS, is any shot that includes the full human body, usually head to toe in the frame. You can also see the environment. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. With a wide shot, you also see the environment in the frame. So you see the subject in relation to the environment. It's often used to orientate the viewer to the space or to cover action. When if you're introduced to a new scene and a new location, often what's sequenced at the start of that scene is an establishing shot, which is like a wide shot of the location. So yes. Whoops, let me use my. Whoa. There we go. So this is a wide shot. Okay, notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You have 11 human subjects in the frame. And notice how wide the framing is. So this is a wide shot. You're seeing subjects from head to toe. You're seeing them all spaced out about in the frame. You're also seeing a lot of the set, the location. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of information in this shot. The proxemics is that we're sort of far away and we're able to see everything. We're not singling in on just like one subject. This is an extreme wide shot or a landscape shot. So notice how much of the landscape we're seeing here in relation to the subject. Don't worry about how to film a long shot. But the only thing, if it helps, usually the camera is obviously positioned far away from the subject. And then the lens that's used is a lower magnification lens, a lens with a low focal length. So a wide angle lens. And yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Okay. For a medium shot, abbreviated MS, this is the shot of a person from the waist up. It simulates how we talk to one another in a conversation, right? If you're standing in front of someone like, I don't know, 4 to 6 feet apart, it kind of looks like a medium shot. The camera is stationed about chest level to subject. I feel like I just said waist up, now I'm saying chest level. Go with about waist up. The viewer sees about equal ratio of subject and space in the frame. It's often used as the dominant shot in a scene, especially between actors. It feels neutral, as if you're standing across from a character. Excuse me, you can see facial expressions and body language. So let's kind of park on this for a second. This is an important one. If you're shooting an actor performing a scene in a medium shot, I'm actually kind of looking at my frame right now. Like I'm sort of in a medium shot. But when you have a medium shot, you can see actors, you can see their facial expressions, and because the framing is wide enough, right, usually about, again, waist to maybe like chest up, you can see their nonverbal cues. You can see them moving their hands. You can see their posture. So it's a little bit more accommodating for performance. That being said, so are wide shots, but with wide shots, you know, you're so far away that you maybe can't see the specifics of facial expressions. So here's a medium shot. This is also a 2-shot, which we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, but just very quickly, a 2-shot just means that you have 2 subjects in the frame. And obviously we have more than that, but clearly they're the focus of the scene. Again, we're starting to see things build up, but we're seeing a shallow depth of field, right? And we're seeing the critical focus is on our 2 subjects. So this is a 2-shot, and then we see this, the shot scale is a medium shot. Notice we obviously get plenty of the location, but you know, it feels like we're about 4 to 6 feet away from these 2 characters, and we're not seeing everything. We're only seeing parts of the set. We're only seeing parts of the other people in the set. This is going to be a single. So here's a medium single shot. We have 1 subject in the frame. And again, we're about mid-chest up. And we see our actor, right? And we see their facial expressions. We'll see some nonverbal cues. But you also have relation of the space as well. And again, hopefully you're starting to maybe think about lighting. And here's also color contrast. You have red lighting, you kind of have that white light as well. I'm not going to talk about the lighting, but again, this is Ernest Dickerson. So I always stop to look at his cinematography. Okay. Don't worry about how to film a medium shot, but just keep in mind, obviously the camera's not going to be positioned nearly as far away as a wide shot, and you're usually using a bit of a tighter lens, usually like a 35 to a 50 millimeter. Okay, for a close-up, now let's get into close-ups. So close-up shots, abbreviated as CU. For a person, it's essentially a headshot from upper mid-chest up. For inanimate objects, the close-up shot highlights the aspects of your subject you want to accentuate. So just to sort of think about this, if you're filming, and again, I shouldn't be using LS, but LS just means long shot. I should be using WS just to make it easier. But if you're filming a wide shot of a barn, and then you're also going in there to film a close-up. So your wide shot is of a barn, and now you want to just focus on one small aspect of that subject. Well, the next thing you might shoot is just a close-up of the barn shingle, and where that barn shingle takes up most of the frame. So for people, the close-up is a very intimate shot and forces the viewer to confront, empathize, connect to human subjects' facial reactions. Some more notes on the close-up. Camera is stationed very close to the subject. The subject dominates the frame rather than the space environment. So you actually start to lose quite a bit of context of the scene, right? It's mostly just the subject. Excuse me. The framing is very intimate. It limits what the viewer can see, highlights details. I think this is an important one. Using a close-up in the middle of a scene will isolate that subject from everything else, right? So if you start a wide shot of like 5 people in the frame, and that's your wide shot, and then the next shot, that sequence is just a close-up of one character, right? You're telling the director's telling you, hey, now look at this. So yeah, okay. So here's a close-up. So here we are. Again, the idea of sort of the very sort of close, intimate framing with a human subject. The frame is cut off just below the subject's chin, and we're even cutting off some of the head here, right? Very tight framing on the subject's face. Again, I'm not going to talk about lighting, but hopefully you're starting to see lighting, highlights, shadow, deep shadow, color temperature, side lighting. Okay, I won't get all into it, but again, keep that stuff going. So that's our close-up. This is an even tighter close-up. So again, compare it to something like this, where you actually are seeing some parts of the set, but not anything like a medium shot, but you see some, right? You see the frame of a window. But as we get even tighter, you're losing quite a bit more. And now we're just focusing on our human subject with only a little bit of information about the location. And again, hopefully you're also noticing angles and positions, right? We're at a frontal position, neutral angle. Now here's an extreme close-up where we're very tight on eyes and we have no relation to the location. And this is a close-up of an object. Sometimes this would be called like an insert shot. So if you're like watching a dialogue scene and in the middle of the scene, someone hands someone else a watch and you cut to this close-up of a watch in someone's hands, that's also called an insert shot. But you'll see, we're very tight on a small object and you can see details, the dials and everything like that. And it's taking out most of the frame. Don't worry about how to film a close-up shot, but again, obviously logistically the camera is stationed much closer to the subject by literally picking up, pulling it closer to the subject, and it's shot with a tighter lens. If you're filming from very far away, you can shoot a close-up with a tight lens, with a lens of like 150 millimeters. So you can be far away, but usually the camera's positioned closer and are using a tighter lens. This is an example of an establishing shot. Okay, so like we're in a new scene. Let's say the scene's a farm. And in this establishing shot, again, the shot scale is wide. It's a wide shot. And we have a bunch of subjects. We see a house. We see this guy. We see her. We see cows. We see trees. So we're seeing many subjects in the frame. You can use this shot scale guide. Again, the ones to kind of keep an eye out for, again, long shot, we're just going to say wide shot, but long shot and sort of all of the kind of building in. Okay, so again, for the setup, every shot is a setup. And again, every shot has every element of cinematography. It has lighting, it has the setup, it has composition, it has color palette, and sometimes it'll have movement. But if you're talking about a shot in a paper, you need to let me know what the setup is before we break it down. So the setup is angle. Is it neutral, high, or low? What is the camera position? Don't really worry about this, okay? Just worry about this. Is it frontal, 3/4 frontal, or rear, profile, or rear? And then shot scales, is it a wide shot, medium shot, or close up, and everything in between. Is it an extreme close up? Is it a medium close up? Okay. Now let's talk about lenses. So I don't know how far I want to get into what lenses. I'll just give you an overview. So here are lenses, all with different focal lengths. You'll have a zoom lens, which looks like, I'm assuming this is a zoom lens because of how long it is. And this has adjustable focal lengths. And then you have prime lenses, which will be something like this or like this, which have fixed focal lengths. So like you'll have, this can only shoot, say, a 24 millimeter focal length. So lenses and shot scales. A camera lens's focal length is measured in millimeters. Higher the millimeter, the higher the magnification. I feel like there's a lot of sort of mystique around lenses. Lenses aren't a big deal. Don't feel like they're overwhelming in any way. It's literally just magnification. The higher the focal length, the higher the magnification. Certain lenses give you different effects. So like a lens with a high magnification, a high focal length, will also give you a shallower depth of field. But again, you don't really need to know this, but I just want to make clear what lenses are. So again, they kind of act like a laboratory microscope where you literally change the focal length to get closer and closer. You can change out lenses for desired magnification and effects. Zoom lenses allow the operator to change the magnification without swapping lenses. You can also perform zooms, which we'll look at with some camera movements. But sometimes if someone's using a zoom lens, you might not even know it because, they'll just adjust the focal length to get closer. But if they're actually recording the zoom, it looks like you're pushing into something. The director of photography may choose a specific lens for shot scale, depth of field, distance requirements, and effects distortion. Excuse me, if you're interested, you could read the rest of that, but don't really worry about it. But there's an idea of when you film a close-up with a wide lens. So this is a lens with a low focal length. And notice, because it's placed so close to the subject, we get this kind of weird distortion of how he's kind of stretched out in the frame. Lens types based on focal length. So if anyone ever says you're using a wide lens, that means you're using a lens with a lower focal length, so 12 millimeter to 24 millimeter. This also gives you a deeper depth of field. A standard or normal lens is anywhere from like 25 to 50. This creates usually a deeper depth of field, but sometimes you'll have a shallow, especially if you get into the 50 millimeter. A telephoto lens just means like a tight lens that again will have a higher magnification. And this is usually 80 millimeter and up, which will give you a shallower depth of field. And then zoom lenses just have adjustable focal lengths. So instead of swapping out lenses to give you different, different magnification, you can have a lens that you can literally go from 18 to 24 to 50 to 75 to 100 all in one lens. This is just another diagram of using different focal lengths, which again, you'll see that shot skills are in relation to this. Don't really worry, you don't have to really worry about this, but if we're in this one position and you're shooting this scene with a 16 millimeter lens, you'll have everything within this box. But then if you're still in the same position, you decide to zoom in to 200 millimeter, or swap out your 16 millimeter with a 200 millimeter lens. Now you are getting your frame to this, right? Your entire frame is this. Okay. I do want to break this down very quickly. Headroom and look room or leave room. Usually in a shot, and it depends. A lot of times you'll see that there's no headroom, right? The subject is literally cut off by the frame. So it always depends, but some things to kind of look out for. Often when you're framing a subject, you want to give them a headroom and look room or lead room. So headroom is just a little bit of space from the top of the subject's head to the top of the frame, okay? And then look room or lead room is spacing on the sides of the frame. So whenever your subject is having like a dialogue scene, usually whoever they're speaking to, you want to give a little bit of room in the rest of the frame. So he's speaking to somebody, obviously, right? Their reverse shot is someone off camera right now, and that person is probably going to be occupying the right third of their frame. And notice he's looking towards that kind of empty space. So we give them a little bit of look room. It's the same thing for like action. So if he is actually going to like maybe walk out of frame, you give a little bit of negative space in this part of the frame so he can move about. So headroom, look, or lead room. Again, just to very quickly break it down, a single shot is when you have one subject in the frame, one human subject in the frame. Over the shoulder shot, which we'll see again later, is when you have two subjects in the frame, but it's not like a clean two shot where you see both people clearly, right? Clearly one person is supposed to be the focus, right? He's sort of in that frontal position. And then for the other subject, the camera is positioned rear or 3/4 rear sometimes. And if you ever see that, if you ever see another part of another person in the frame like that, and it can change, sometimes it'll be like the side of their cheek or literally their shoulder. That's called an over the shoulder shot. So a single is a clean frame like that, over the shoulder, something like that. Two shot is you have a very sort of clean frontal shot. Sometimes it could be profile, doesn't matter. But in this case, we're in a frontal sort of medium shot, two subjects in the same shot, occupying the shot together. You can see two actors perform simultaneously. Okay, so I just want to go through that quickly. Now, labeling shots. When you label shots, you know, if you're going to break down a shot for all 5 ounces of cinematography, which you will do, I need to know what the shot is before you break down the rest of it. So you need to label the shot, specifically label the setup. For shot scales, use abbreviations. So for a wide shot, use WS. For a medium shot, use MS. For a close-up, use CU. You can also make additional notes, like if the close-up is a very tight close-up, maybe it's a tight close-up on eyes, you would maybe say it's a tight close-up eyes. Over the shoulder is OTS, and then extreme, just put an E in front of it. So extreme close-up or extreme wide shot. So here we go. So, excuse me. So this is the actual format, how I want you to label a shot. And again, this is just like part one, right? You're going to label the shot and then break down the rest of it via the cinematography. But to label shots, you need to label the setup. What is the setup? So here it is. The shot scale, in parentheses, the angle, dash, position, subject, action. And pretty soon we're going to get to movement, and you would list the movement after position. But for now, we're not even there yet. So just go shot scale, angle, dash, position, subject, action. Again, if there is movement, list it before position. I'm surprised I haven't before. You could do it after position too. I feel like that would make sense. Even in my example, this is clearly a mistake on my end. In my example, I have the movement after. So again, do shot scale, angle in parentheses, dash, position in parentheses. If there's a movement, list the movement, which we'll talk about in a bit, and then subject action. So here we go. There's my example. I have a wide shot. It's a high angle, frontal position, and then the movement is pan across baseball field. Now, we're not even in movement yet, so I could also just do wide shot, high angle, frontal, baseball field. It's the subject. Now, if someone's walking across the baseball field, I'll do wide shot, high angle, frontal, Bob walks across baseball field. And I think I have some more examples. So again, labeling shots, a shot is just a recorded setup. So when labeling shots, break down the setup first. Mention the shot scale, angle, and position. And if there's a movement, mention it. So I have some more examples here. Wide shot, neutral, profile, Marge throws ball. Close up, high, frontal, baseball gripped in Marge's hand, close-up, neutral, frontal, Marge's eyes. I would maybe even note that as extreme close-up. So maybe ECU, neutral, frontal, Marge's eyes. Again, we'll talk more about this with movement, but with some movements, the shot scale will change, right? The scale of the shot will change. So if I have a dolly in where the camera actually pushes into a subject, I'm going to note that in my shot scale. So I'm going to say we go from a wide shot to a close-up. The whole time it's a neutral angle and the whole time the position is frontal. And then we dolly in as Marge throws the ball. So again, make sure to label your shots correctly. All right, so a quick note, when you're analyzing film, you'll be using cinematography as filmic evidence. If you're going to talk about cinematography, do not make it abstract, and let me know what shot you're breaking down first before you talk about the other elements of cinematography. So make sure to note and label the setup of the shot, then break it down via the other elements of cinematography. Okay, so we're gonna do a little bit of a checkpoint. So I'm gonna show you a couple of setups here. Make sure to properly label the following shot/setups with shot scale, angle, position, subject, action. And in addition to that, think maybe back on sources of lighting too, which we won't have time to talk about, but think about the reasoning for these setups. So here we go. I'm going to park on this for just a second. So what is the shot scale, angle, and position? And any other maybe notes on setup. Okay, so I'm going to break it down. So this is one of those things where it gets kind of fluid, right? We're dealing with a two-shot, and we have two subjects. One is in frontal, the other is kind of rear, 3/4 rear. So I'd probably just go with frontal for position. But let's go back. So what shot scale is it? Is it wide, medium, close-up? And think about both how subjects are positioned in the frame, but also how much of the space we're seeing. Okay, so I would go wide shot. I understand if maybe you're saying medium because we're close to waist up, but think not only in relation to the subject, but again, how much space we're seeing. So we're seeing quite a bit of space, right? We're dealing with a lot of information in the shot. So I would go wide shot. Angle, is this low, high, or neutral? Low, right? We're stationed below the subjects and kind of tilted up at them. They hover over the frame. And then I already said position, I'd probably just go frontal. So to label this, we would go wide shot, low angle, frontal position. And then say, I forget the characters' names, but Brad Pitt points gun at camera while Morgan Freeman turns back on camera, something like that. Okay, here's another one. So what is our shot scale, angle, and position? And any other notes on the type of shot? Okay, so here we're dealing with an over the shoulder, right? We have a shoulder, and we're also, and again, this is something else, but this is a shallow depth of field. Foreground is soft focus, background is critical. But we have an over the shoulder. Our shot scale, I would say, is wide, right? Again, notice our subject in relation to the amount of space that we're seeing in the scene, and we're seeing production design. So about a wide shot. Angle, I would go neutral. And then position, I would say 3/4 frontal, right? Because this is really the subject we're focusing on, and we're kind of coming from the amount of 3/4 frontal, where this subject is 3/4 rear, but don't worry about that. So I would go wide shot, wide, neutral, 3/4 frontal or frontal position. Okay, here's another one. Now for a shot scale, would you go wide or medium? This is kind of a tricky one. And again, you're never gonna have a test where I show you a shot and go, is this wide or medium? Because again, many times it kind of lives on a spectrum. So in this example, it's kind of weird, right? I would probably say it's a wide, but at the same time, our human subject is very much in that kind of medium framing. But look at, again, how much of the scene we're seeing. And it's not like the example at the ballroom or the shot with Denzel Washington, where you were seeing parts of the set, but not nearly as much as you are here. Now, again, if you said this was a medium, I wouldn't say that's wrong, but I would probably say it's living towards a wide. So again, so shot scale, I'd probably go wide or medium, because our human subject is very much living in that kind of medium framing, right, mid-chest and up. Okay. And then what is the angle? Neutral, high, or low? Neutral. Good. And then what else? What else are you seeing here? We're seeing a canted angle. So it's neutral, but it's also canted. It's Dutch. It's crooked. It's purposely crooked. And then our position is frontal. Maybe 3/4 frontal, but I'd probably go frontal. All right. And again, we don't have time for it, but I hope you're thinking about lighting, and I hope you're thinking about maybe focus. Okay. So here we go. We're going to move into composition. Now, hopefully you're going to notice a seamless break, but I myself am going on a little pause here. And I suggest maybe you do the same, because again, this is a very heavy content presentation. So I'm pausing my own, but you won't see anything here. You'll see a jump cut. So I'll be right back. Okay. Well, I'm back. The cough drop. So we're moving into composition. And I'm just starting my timer again. Okay. We're moving into composition, which is the third element of cinematography. So composition is the careful placement of subjects and objects in the frame. How the director of photography uses space in the frame. Also how actors and mise-en-scene are placed in the frame. Very quickly, mise-en-scene is a French term for placing on the stage what we see on screen in a shot/scene. All the elements on screen and their arrangement, the arrangement of the setting, decor, lighting, costumes. Lighting, to be specific, here we're talking about like the practical sources we see in the frame, but it's just the organization of these elements, right? This is also production design, which we'll talk about next module. The big takeaway here is composition is the very deliberate and strategic kind of spacing of all these different subjects within the frame, and using this different thirds of the frame to space these elements out. All right, so features of composition. You have aspect ratio, rule of thirds, foreground and background, depth of field, layering of the frame, and symmetry and asymmetry. And we're going to go over each one here. The one to really focus on, though, I think, is rule of thirds. And obviously, we already mentioned foreground and background, but I would say these three are going to sort of be our focus for composition. And I want you to use the rule of thirds grid when you're decoding compositions. So aspect ratio, very quickly, is just sort of the size of the frame that cinematographers have to work with. And you can choose different aspect ratios. Aspect ratio is just the width to height ratio of the frame. We often see 16:9 framing, which is just 16 wide, 9 high, and it's measured in units. Some DOPs shoot in specific aspect ratios. Don't worry about cropping, but just know cropping is different than aspect ratio. Don't really worry about that. So 4:3 is a 4:3 aspect ratio. Notice, right, literally the monitor that this is being projected onto doesn't have this information because it's not as wide, but it is taller. So we have a little bit more space here in comparison to a 16:9. Right, notice how wide this aspect ratio is. There's many other aspect ratios, but you don't really have to worry about that. Okay, this is one of the things I really want to focus on, using the rule of thirds. So I'm going to break down all of the different thirds of a frame and all of the opportunity basically cinematographers have to compose an image. And to really understand how it's done is we need to use the same tool that cinematographers do. So cinematographers and videographers use a rule of thirds grid, which is a grid that is displayed on the monitor that they're using that splits the frame into thirds to guide interest. And I'm going to show you a few examples here, but usually the lines that intersect are theoretically points of interest for the audience. Excuse me. But another way is that it just allows the director of photography to fully utilize the space of the frame. It's the use of the left, center, and right side of the frame, use of top, middle, and bottom of frame. Please use this tool when breaking down a composition. I want you to be this specific. I want you to say in, the cinematographer placed the train on the left third of the frame to show a contrast and scale between the human figure that's in the bottom left of the frame, which we'll actually do. And then sometimes cinematographers make deliberate choices by making certain areas of the frame empty of subjects. This is called negative space. So here we go. You might want to like write this down as sort of your own grid, but this is a rule of thirds grid. Okay. And I'm just going to kind of name and my labels here. So we have the top, middle, excuse me, sorry, the top, oh boy, middle and bottom of the frame. Then we have the left, center, and right third of the frame. And as you can see, they're kind of blocked off here. So to kind of talk it through very quickly, we have many subjects in the frame, right? All these, the mise-en-scene, the production design of the lamps, lamp, tennis table, dartboard, the light panels, the foosball table, our human subjects sitting down, even like the carpeting, the trimming here, so many subjects, it's overwhelming. But let's look at how the cinematographer and the director compose the image by spacing out all these various subjects along the frame. So our top third of the frame is for our light panel. Our bottom left third is the lamp. Bottom right third, lamp. The center of the frame, we have another lamp. Towards left center, we have another lamp, right center. In the middle of the frame directly, we have the dartboard. And if you keep going here, we start to see things connecting to our human subject. And our human subject is placed in the bottom third of the frame. And also notice where his eye lines are, those points of intersection come through and his eyes hit that bottom line there. And another thing, we're going to talk about symmetrical framing, but if you were to divide this frame in half and fold it in on one another, they would sort of be even. So there's a very sort of deliberate composition here. And again, this is from the movie Get Out. And if you guys have seen it, you could maybe start decoding why Jordan Peele used this type of composition and why he placed the human subject so small in the frame, right? By positioning him in this bottom center and all these other pieces sort of overcrowding him is sort of representative of some of the themes of the film and him becoming a sort of suppressed character and then fighting back that suppression in the last act. But just in this one composition, you can see the sort of metaphorical framing going on. Okay, we're going to do another example. So we have 1, 2, 3. I'm going to count this as 4. We have 4 major subjects: the train, the person, the mountains, the sky. My rule of thirds grid is a little goofy on here. I did a better job on this one, but it gives you a general idea. What is occupying the left third of the frame? The train. What is occupying the bottom? The person. What is occupying the right bottom third? Mountains. What's occupying the top right third? Sky. Okay, so we see all these subjects very evenly composed. Nothing is stacked up on one another. Now start thinking about why. And this also relates to shot scale, right? Again, everything is bleeding into one another, and I just don't have time to say, hey, what's the lighting? What's the shot scale? What's the setup? Blah, blah, blah. But think about, in relation to composition, why do you think the director, Michael Cimino, composed the image like this? Okay, well, one thing might be that he wants the train to feel like this kind of oppressive force, right? It's giant in comparison to the person. And by placing the person in this wide shot scale and placing them in the bottom third of the frame, we see a scale between the two. And we also see sort of a juxtaposition with technology and nature. Right now there's a division by putting the mountains in the sky on the right third of the frame and drawing a contrast between nature and industry. Again, this is what you're going to be doing, decoding shots like this. Okay, this is an example of negative space. So we have the left and most of the center of the frame is empty. And instead, the director, Ava DuVernay, is placing two subjects in basically the right third of the frame, a little bit right of center. So she's deliberately using negative space to, you know, kind of draw in maybe the emotions of this scene. And instead of making it feel sort of intimate, it feels a little bit more depressive in a way, right? We maybe start to feel the loss that the characters are feeling in this moment by not giving us this kind of like emotional, you know, very sort of frontal, intimate framing. So again, use it very deliberately. Okay. We're now going to talk about foreground and background. Foreground in the frame are just the images / subjects closest to the viewer. The images / subjects closest to the camera is another way to look at it. And then background are the images / subjects beyond the foreground. So foreground, background. Again, we're not going to talk about lighting and composition and setup, but it's there and we should. I just don't have time. We have, I don't remember all the characters' names, so we're going to go with actors. We have Wesley Snipes, Norman Reedus, Chris Christopherson, all in the frame. Who is in the foreground? Who is closest to the viewer, closest to the camera? Wesley Snipes. Okay, who is in the background? Norman Reedus, Chris Christopherson, and then obviously like the actual set and location. Okay, here's another example. Who's in the foreground? Who's in the background? Who's closest to the viewer? Jamie Lee Curtis. Who's in the background? Michael Myers. And again, in this example, you can probably already tell how filmmakers strategically use the foreground and background, right? This is a case of, you know, for like something scary. We see something that I think Laurie Strode is her name, but Jamie Lee Curtis' character doesn't see, and it's unsettling, right? We see the horror creeping up and she doesn't. Okay, in addition to foreground, background, we're going to go one step further with depth of field. So as a reminder, shallow depth of field is when one of two planes are in focus, either the foreground or background are in focus. So you either have a shallow foreground or background. Deep depth of field is when both the foreground and background are in focus. And then split diopter is an attachment to the lens that kind of cheats a deep depth of field. And I just kind of want you to be able to notice that. So here's a shallow depth of field. So our foreground, John Voight. Sorry, I got a cough drop. And then our background is this character in the kind of like silhouette lighting. And we're using a shallow depth of field. Is our foreground or background soft focus? Background, right? Background is soft focus. Our foreground is critical focus. So we're seeing a shallow depth of field. critical focus, soft focus. Deep depth of field, everything in the frame is in focus, right? Both foreground and background. Obviously, we get a slight dip in focus eventually, but even our deepest background is in focus. Here's a split diopter. And again, this is just something to notice. Here we are with sort of a, I guess you would call this a two-shot, where Costner is in profile and Connery is in frontal, 3/4 frontal. But what this is a cheat. I'm not going to get into it because I'm looking at my clock here. I'm getting close to 250. But if you see this blurry line, that tells us that this is this attachment that they placed on the lens to basically cheat it. So instead of forcing one of the planes to be in soft focus, you basically trick the lens to say, hey, you know what? Both the foreground and background are going to be in focus. So you kind of cheat a deep depth of field. Excuse me. I also want you to think about cinematographers consciously layering the frame. So how the mise-en-scene and characters are blocked in a shot, and how the director of photography frames those subjects for effect. And remember, blocking is the choreography of movement in a shot/scene. But by layering the frame, you create layers and depth to the composition. Subjects and objects in the foreground and background inform one another. Use rule of thirds and foreground background to decode layering. So again, I'm running a little low on time, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. But by thinking about foreground and background, using your rule of thirds to split up the grid, think about how we're seeing, well, how much information we're seeing in the frame in this one composition. We see an interview being conducted with Morgan Freeman and one suspect in the left third panel, in the left third of the frame there. The right third of the frame, we see an interview between Brad Pitt and a suspect. Then if we look at our foreground, we see somebody actually listening in to the conversation. And again, we don't have time for it, but I hope you're also thinking about lighting in this shot. Here's another example of layering the frame and how we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subjects all placed in the frame with a bit of, deliberate framing of how we're placing this subject in the frame. It's a weird frame to pause on. I think we already talked about layering the frame. I'm going to keep going. Then we have ensemble framing. So this is careful framing to photograph an ensemble of performing actors. Again, an ensemble are multiple actors performing in a scene together. And by using ensemble framing, instead of just using close-ups for every actor and cutting back and forth, some films, especially older films, rely on ensemble framing because they want you to see how, this actor is reacting to this other actor all within the same shot. So by using ensemble framing, I'm going to pause as I let my dog out. So by using ensemble framing, you're allowed to have many actors in one shot acting across from one another and being able to see how they're reacting. So each character is carefully blocked for visual interest and for performance. The idea of an actor being open to the camera, which I'll talk about in a second, but consider how they are blocked and framed on priority of character power dynamics. So here's a quick example, and I'll probably only do one because I know I'm running out of time. But using the rule of thirds grid, notice how each subject is spaced in the frame, and they're performing the scene, and we're able to see everyone, right? We're not cutting in between close-ups. And by the way they're blocked, we can see 3/4 rear, frontal, profile, profile. So we can see, each actor bouncing off one another just by using this one wide shot. And again, I won't do it because we don't have time, but think about what's the setup, what's the lighting. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip some of our other examples, but we have some more ensemble framing. All right, so now let's talk about symmetry and asymmetry. Symmetry is the subjects, objects, and frame are balanced within the frame. Both sides of the frame are identical if you kind of draw an imaginary line in between. Asymmetry is the framing of subjects and objects in frame are not balanced. There's a shift between the two halves of the frame. Usually what you see is our compositions trying to find like somewhat of a balance. It won't be perfectly symmetrical. Sometimes it is, but usually films kind of find like a balance, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is an extreme example of symmetrical framing, even down to having, you know, how many subjects in like the right third of the frame here in comparison to the left third, by placing not only people as their subjects, but also just objects, right? The mise-en-scene placement is also sort of matching. So this is a very symmetrical composition. And again, this is kind of usually what you see, this idea of a balanced symmetrical framing. So if one subject is in the left third of the frame, you're going to have some sort of balance on the right third, usually. And then we have another example of very asymmetrical, where one subject is kind of crammed on, you know, 1/3 of the frame there. Okay, again, I'm kind of rushing through some of this, which I don't like to do. So I don't know if we're going to do this activity, but maybe I'll just park on both of these and you can do it yourself. So I'm going to see two compositions, or I'm sorry, you're going to see two compositions where I just want to know which composition do you think is more interesting, and use your tools so far through composition, rule of thirds, foreground, background, depth of field, layering of the frame, symmetrical and asymmetrical. You could also talk about lighting, or think about lighting and the setup. But just think about, you know, how much information you're seeing in these two shots and which one do you think is more effective. And again, I'm just gonna have you do it on your own. But here's shot one. And I would argue both of these are sort of communicating similar things, but just through the use of the rule of thirds, what you're seeing on the left third of the frame, what you're seeing on the right third of the frame, what you're seeing in the foreground to the background, how the background is informing the foreground, the use of depth of field here, how the background is a little bit soft in comparison to this. Okay, so here we see much more maybe symmetrical framing. Our subject is towards the center of the frame. Take that in for a second. The use of a deep depth of field in this example. I'm just looking at my timer. And what you're seeing in maybe the far background of the shot and how that's informing the foreground. Okay. So I need to get through the next two in half an hour, which I think I could do. So camera movement. Let's talk about camera movement. With camera movement, there's motivated or unmotivated camera movement. Motivated is when the camera moves with the subject. So if a subject is walking across a room and the camera tracks along with them, it's motivated. It's motivated by their movement. Oftentimes you'll see things that are unmotivated, or they're motivated by like emotion, or they're motivated by theme, with the idea that the camera moves freely independent from the subject. So maybe during like a dramatic moment or after a dramatic line of dialogue, the camera pushes in to the subject's eyes to underline that line. That's an unmotivated camera movement. So here's our camera movement types, and the video, which I'll share in just a second, will demonstrate each one of these. But you have a static camera. That just means that the camera does not move. It just is in one position and stays there and observes action. A pan, is with a stationary camera. However, the camera literally scans horizontally. So you're in one position, but the camera just scans horizontally. So it's actually not moving in any way or following, but it just sort of scans. And then tilt is the same idea, but vertically. So you're in one position, but you just scan vertically. And then dollying, this is when the camera actually starts moving. The camera moves freely, usually towards or away from a subject or around. If you're pushing in, that's a dolly in, or if you're pushing out, it's a dolly out. If you're dollying horizontally, that's actually called trucking. But you could always just say like we dolly around Bob. That's fine too. Or yeah, to be very clear, it's not the same thing as a zoom. I'm going to show you some zooms, and you'll see how a dolly is much more controlled and steady, while a zoom is even if it's a slow zoom, is just not as smooth, and it's a little bit more erratic. Tracking, this is when the camera moves with or follows subject as it moves. It's often stationed in front of or behind the subject. So if the subject is walking towards the camera literally tracks with them as they walk towards the camera. Crane shot is similar to a dolly. The only difference is that it's on a crane, so the camera can also move vertically. And again, I'm doing these weird pantomimes, but the video will demonstrate this better. So I'm going to show you the video, and we'll just watch it straight through, and maybe I'll offer a little bit of commentary on each one to help contextualize. But keep an eye out for title cards, which will tell you what type of movement you're about to see, and then also lower thirds that will give you commentary on each movement. So get a feel for what the movement looks like. Okay. Okay, so let's just talk about this briefly. I have a feeling we might go over the 250, but I'm going to try to stay close to it. the previous video was way shorter than 250, so I'm gonna use that as an excuse. Okay, so very quickly, I want to show you this dolly movement. And again, I note it as trucking, but you can also just say, we dolly around Robert Bacall. That's Denzel Washington's character. But notice it's horizontal, right? We're on dolly tracks, which I'll show you a picture of, and the camera's just, on its own, moving around the subject, right? We go from like a 3/4 rear to almost a frontal position. And then we start to see some dolly in and dolly out. So just very quickly, as Denzel Washington approaches the camera, notice how we move also towards him. We push in, we dolly in. And then when we cut to the rear, and Antoine Fuqua uses a dolly out. Okay, very smooth, controlled, very cinematic. And then once the two characters kind of square up and start talking, notice the camera is static. Okay, pan and tilt very quickly. Tilt, we are in the same position, but again, this is the idea of the camera sort of scanning. We're not really moving, but the tilt is sort of positioning the camera a little. It's difficult to explain, but again, it's the idea that we're not moving towards anything, right? We're just scanning up, scan down, so some vertical movement. But again, the position isn't really changing. Pan, scan horizontally. Okay. And then this is going to show us static. Then we move into our crane shot where we begin to pan with subjects. Then we start trucking along with them. And then this tells us we're on a crane because notice the camera lifts up vertically towards the end. There we go. And then we'll do a little bit of tracking shot. So this is a tracking shot. This was done with a Steadicam, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. But we're tracking with the subjects. They walk towards the camera, we move along with them. This is a tracking shot. It's a frontal, and then we also have a rear. Okay, and notice there's no dolly tracks, right? We're using a Steadicam here. The zooms, notice how fast they are, right? And they're not nearly as controlled as that dolly. Even when you have a very slow zoom out like this, right? It still has a little bit of like a lag to the movement, while dollies are incredibly smooth and cinematic. Okay. So again, I'm going to try to finish this by the 2:50 mark because I know this is a lot, but I don't want to rush it either. So stay with me. I'm using my leftover time from the last module here. But I think it's good that we have it all in just one, the 5 elements of cinematography all in one presentation. Okay. This is a tripod. So this is one of the rigs that are used to stabilize a camera. This is often used for static camera work, but also you can loosen the head of the tripod, which is this right here, to pull off like pans and tilts. So you're in one position, but now you can actually, use the camera to sort of scan. Here's our dolly. So this is what I was talking about with dolly tracks. And notice it's on this sort of system here that runs on the tracks. That's how you get that very smooth movement. Here's our jib or crane. Okay. So again, you can swivel, but then you can also lift for vertical movement. Okay, and then we have our shoulder mount, which you didn't really see an example of, but often this kind of gives you more of a handheld look, which I'll show you an example of in a second. It gives the operator sort of more of a free movement to move the camera with. Here's our Steadicam, which was used for the tracking shots, which is like a body harness and gives the camera almost like a dolly effect, right? It's very controlled, smooth movement, but allows the operator to move along with subjects in a more free way. So again, the note on noting movement and screen direction. With dolly movement, sometimes the shot scale will change as we dolly in from a medium shot to a close-up of a stationary subject. So, you know, if we had a shot of Denzel Washington sitting at the table and we just dollied into his face from, say, like a medium shot, you want to note that. So how to note that? You want to note the change of shot scale. So wide shot to close-up, neutral, frontal, dolly in from Bob eating soup to close-up of lips. Right? So that tells us what we're dollying into. Screen direction is the direction that actors or objects appear to be moving on the screen from the point of view of the camera audience. And you may have already heard me use notes like camera left, camera right. For the most part, just use rule of thirds, right? If you're breaking down a composition, just mention things like in the right third of the frame, etc. I only use camera left, camera right when we were talking about lighting because I didn't want to kind of introduce that quite yet. Okay. But you can also say things like, Sally walks from camera left to camera right. But again, just use the rule of thirds, right? Sally starts in the left third of the frame and then moves to the right third of the frame if you, for some reason, need to mention that. Okay, I also want to talk about controlled versus handheld camera movement. So everything we saw, aside from maybe the Captain Phillips stuff, were all controlled camera work. So all that movement was very smooth, right? But you can also have handheld camera work, and this could be static shots, but you'll literally see the frame kind of jitter. Controlled camera movement is very precise and steady. It's usually achieved with a dolly or a jib. It takes several takes/practice runs to perfect. It's often objective and cinematic. It feels like you're watching a movie. Handheld is when the operator uses a support rig like a shoulder rig or literally holds the camera. This brings a shaky and subjective feel to the shots. It's usually meant to be either immediate or erratic. It feels like you are there. So very quickly for handheld, again, it can just be static, right? You'll see a lot of movies that are just dialogue scenes of the camera being static, but you just notice the camera sort of bumps a little bit. That means it's handheld. And I'll, again, show you an example of this. I'm going to stop talking and just show you. So just a quick note, the next video is going to be a handheld versus controlled. If you get motion sickness, you may want to check out for the next couple of minutes because there's a handheld tracking shot that's pretty extreme. But then we'll talk over those. Okay. Okay, so again, I know I'm getting close on time, um, but just a few things I want to point out for the handheld. So this is our tracking, and again, notice how unstable the frame is, right? So we're literally moving, we're doing a tracking shot, but this is the handheld example. And then just also let's take a look at the handheld for dialogue. Obviously much more subtle because we're dealing with static shots essentially where the frame, where the, we are just operating handheld. And look at just again, this sort of unstable frame. Right, it's not extreme, but you'll notice that we sort of bump with the frame every now and then. And here we have like a little pan. Right, it's subtle, but it's there. It's just not, it's not completely controlled in comparison to something like this, right, where we're completely still. Okay. So I have 11 minutes. And again, I have a feeling this is going to go over, and I'm sorry. But the previous module, I believe, was like just over an hour. So I should give me a little bit of leeway here. Okay. Now let's move into color palette. And we're going to see some overlap with color temperature because it definitely plays a part with color palette. And I'm going to bring it up again and even use the same slides, but I just kind of want you to form those connections again. So color palette. I mentioned this term before, but I didn't really define it when we talked about lighting. But color contrast. So we have tonal contrast and we have color contrast. Color contrast is the manipulation of differing colors in an image. Excuse me. Another way to put it is that it's the oh boy, what was I getting at? Color contrast is the manipulation of different colors in the image. It's the manipulation of the color palette in an image. The difference between cool colors, blues, and warm colors, reds, and everything in between. Think of it like that tonal contrast scale, but with color. Color contrast can come through production design, costume design, color temperature via lighting, and post-production looks/filters. So here's another example of high color contrast. And this one is a little bit different than the previous example I showed you because we have a range of color temperature, right? We have blue light. Then we also have red light. So we're getting a color contrast between blue and red via color temperature and gold or tungsten. And we also get a little bit on the subject as well. So that's one level, right? We're seeing color contrast through color temperature, but you're also seeing color contrast through production design. Costume, white, either like a deep blue or black, gray, and then obviously the set itself has lighting features. The black of the set is also working in here as well. The neon sign over here. So again, we're seeing a color contrast through the entire color palette, the palette patterns in the frame and color temperature. Whoops. So our first element of color palette is looking at the color patterns within the frame or the color patterns through the mise-en-scene. This is the choice of what colors are present in the frame, in the mise-en-scene, the arrangement of scenery and stage properties, the color patterns within the production and costume design, which we'll talk about next module, just to kind of fully define those. But it's the pattern colors in the production design wardrobe, all the tangible elements in the frame, from costumes to props to the color of walls. This is usually crafted by the production designer, art director, and wardrobe in collaboration with the director and director of photography to maintain a consistent color palette. So here's the color patterns and frame. Again, I'll just kind of park on it for a second. But what two primary colors are we seeing here just in the production design? Okay, so I'm going to break it down very quickly. I would go with white and red. Red, 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 red jacket, red, red. Then we have white. Whoops, and I almost missed another red. Red on the tile. Then we have white, white sink, white light, white wall, white ceiling, white light, white urinal, white flooring, and then did I already say we had his red jacket, we have his white gloves, right? There's a very deliberate sort of binary setup of red and white in the production design. And it's not through color temperature, right? The color temperature is just like a neutral white light. This is strictly through production design. Okay, then we have looks. Looks are sort of just applied to the film. You saw this in the Minority Report clip. That movie has a very sort of post-production, what's what I'm looking for? Post-production tweak for the color palette. But we have different looks. So the overall picture look, the look can be muted or desaturated. It can be saturated. There can be distinct filters placed on, or it just kind of, has more of a naturalistic look. But muted desaturated gives a toned down, washed out look. The vibrancy of colors have been sort of dialed back. Saturated, the colors in the frame have an otherworldly sort of intensity or pop to them. Filters are applied to the film to give it a primary hue to the entire shot. It's usually applied to the film in post-production via a digital intermediate. Digital film is shot flat and then graded in post-production to give you these different looks. So here's our look from flat to graded. So when you shoot digital, you shoot in this log format, and then in post-production, you could say, you know what, I want the blues of the water and the sky to be much more vibrant and saturated, and I actually want to add in like a little yellowish glow to the sun, and you can start seeing the, huge range from washed out to high saturation. And I'll show you some more examples. Whoops. So here's our muted desaturated. So again, they shot this as they would, but then they dialed back the greenery, right? Notice how pale the greens are. Look at the sky, how grayed out the sky is. This is the idea of a muted or desaturated look where colors are dialed back. And it almost looks black and white in a way, but not quite. Here's saturated. Now this is not an overly dramatic example, but go back to our first color palette example, but color patterns in the frame. We're dealing with a lot of green, 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 some green on her dress, sort of a green, his green tie, even his jacket sort of has a shade of it. And notice that it's a little bit more vibrant than usual. Same thing with like the reds on their lips, the reds on her dress, the yellow on her dress. It's not overly saturated, but it's just a hair more than a sort of naturalistic look. This is a filter. So this is pretty dramatic, but this is just a blue filter applied to the shot. Again, they shot this like normal and then applied this in post-production to give this primary blue hue. And if you compare this to that use of like color temperatures, right, there's no shape to it. It's clearly not a light. This is just a filter that's been applied to the entire shot. Okay, now we're going to go back to color temperature. Now, because we talked about it, maybe we won't spend nearly as much time, but just keep in mind color temperature also plays a part in the color palette. How the set and scene is going to be lit and what color the lights are going to influence the color palette. So remember our color temperature chart from warm all the way to blues and very cool and everything in between. And then you also have like color lights that fit outside of this, like red lights, green lights, blue lights, purple lights, those very sort of saturated color lights. Again, we did this already, so I'm not going to go too much further, but tungsten, and again, take note of how this is not a filter, right? Compare this to this. Notice how the light actually strikes the subject, sculpts them out from shadows, right? We actually get a lighting effect. So this is just color temperature through the color of lighting. Natural color lights. And again, mixed color temperature. And this is mostly, again, I already showed this, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but Here we have a color contrast primarily through the color temperature, right? Our production design has some of it, right? It's kind of hard to tell because of the colored light, but we see like this is probably a red. We see a little bit of a white here, but for the most part, our color contrast is coming from the color temperature. Red, left third of the frame, center, purple, right, blue, and a little bit some more as well. All right, we're getting close to the end here. So I think we might actually maybe finish during my 2:50 cutoff. So just keep in mind, oh, actually that's not true because we're gonna do one more activity. So keep in mind, the director of photography doesn't work by themselves, okay? They have a whole crew of people that help them. From the camera operator, who's the person who literally operates the camera, they look through the viewfinder, they make small changes like focus shifts or camera movement shifts. Some director photographies operate, but most don't. Same with directors. Some directors use a cinematographer for like lighting, but the director actually likes to operate the camera themselves. It all depends. A gaffer is the chief electrician who is in charge with overseeing the setup of lights as instructed by the director of photography. And then the grip is in charge of labor when it comes to equipment for lighting and camera. So recap, 5 elements of cinematography. Remember, every shot has each one of these 5 elements. Lighting, setup, composition, camera movement, color palette. So when you're breaking down a shot, you're decoding those choices, those levels of encoding. Okay. One thing I want to introduce during this presentation, and again, we'll probably be done in about 15 minutes, so give me about 15 more minutes, but this stuff's very important. When you're analyzing a film and for a paper, I'll say things like focus on a key scene. Now within that key scene, maybe quote a line of dialogue and also focus on one key shot. All a key shot is so I'll just read it, I guess. But when watching a key scene, examine key shots that seem to comment on the action and or dialogue present in the scene. Think about how in this one shot, the director is using the 5 elements of cinematography to contribute additional meaning. Think about how the director of DOP is strategically utilizing the 5 elements of cinematography to contribute meaning. Often moments of a scene are shot. So yeah, just for a quick example. Nowadays, a film is often influenced by TV, and if you watch a TV show or if you watch a lot of like big movies that come out nowadays, and this is a huge generalization, but a lot of times you see like a dialogue scene is just shot for, and we saw this in Hail Caesar. It's just a medium neutral angle, frontal or 3/4 frontal setup on an actor saying their dialogue. Well, when it's not that, and when you see really strong choices in lighting and all the other elements of cinematography, think about why. Why did they put in this extra effort to further encode this shot with cinematography-based choices to contribute meaning? Okay, so some final reminders. Every shot features the 5 elements of cinematography. Always consider why the director made the cinematography choice that they did. How is their choice in cinematography encoding the scene with further meaning? What are they adding to the scene that's not on the page? Think of key shots within the scene. So we're going to watch the Jesse James scene one more time, but now you know the formal elements of cinematography, and I want you to be reflecting on this. I'm not going to read all the credits here, but just very quickly, the director of photography is Roger Deakins. The director is Andrew Dominic. All right, so just as a recap, I'm not going to read this all out loud, but I'm going to show you the scene one more time. And now, hopefully you participate on the first go around, but those sort of subjective feelings that you had, start linking those to the formal choices. So what are you seeing via lighting, the setups, the composition, camera movement, color palette, as bringing these things together? And again, if we did this in person, what I would do is actually like pause. I'd ask you guys like, hey, give me one shot and I'll pause on that shot and let you talk about it. Obviously that's not going to happen, but I'm going to play it and maybe we'll park on a couple shots and talk about them. Okay, so we're going to watch the scene again, this time again with no audio. Note the overall lighting choices for the scene. Again, the lighting doesn't shift too much. Sometimes it does. in the scene, and then note a few key shots that speak to you. Which moments of the scene are isolated with these key shots and why? How did that contribute to the mood / theme of the scene? So now start matching your feelings with filmic evidence with choices in cinematography. Okay. So again, I'm gonna go ahead and share. I'll try not to make this too much longer, but please, I hope you're still watching. Okay. So again, I usually ask you guys to give me a shot to park on and talk about. But in this case, and because of time, I'm just going to go over maybe one or two of my favorites. So let's start here. So we start in about a medium. We are about neutral angle. We're about 3/4 rear is the setup. And notice we start here static, but then the camera dollies in. So we dolly in past Jesse James into complete black, right? Complete shadow. Before, I'm just going to go back just a second. If we look at the lighting, we're dealing with, just in this one shot, we're dealing with a high tonal contrast, right? We have, let me use my little tool. Highlight is the human subject, Jesse James. He is clearly separated with hard lighting out from the shadows. And if we look at the color temperature, he's lit with a tungsten light. The natural source that we're simulating is from his lantern, and it's giving that tungsten golden sort of hue. And again, separating him from the shadows. Okay, and then we dolly in. So we go from, again, sort of that medium 3/4 rear, and we dolly into the darkness, complete shadow. We hold, so now this is also with editing, but the duration of the shot is quite long. We hold until we see the train slowly come across the frame. I'm just going to pause again. So we're still in the same shot. We haven't cut. And we're holding on this shot, and we just see this train bringing this huge amount of light. And if you look at the color temperature, it's no longer tungsten, but now we're dealing with this kind of white light. And that white light is cutting through the darkness. So we have the deep shadows being cut through by the train. And notice these shafts of light. So now we finally cut and we're in a new shot. But that shot always kind of stuck out to me. And again, just for sake of time, I won't do this for like 4 hours. And I'm just going to focus on this one shot. So why do you think why make these choices? And again, think about also composition. He's on the left third of the frame. We push into darkness. We hold. I'm going to skip a little bit forward. But the train starts to emerge sort of in the center right of the frame. So giving us a separation between the two subjects. Why do you think make this choice? Okay, so I'm going to offer a little bit of commentary on there. So we broke down the lighting. I think we broke it down relatively well. We broke down the setup. We broke down the camera movement. The color palette we broke down. We're dealing with, you know, really in the production design is black. It's his costume and then the shadows. And then through the color temperature, we're getting that kind of golden yellow and then the white of the light. And also the train is black. So we're kind of dealing with not a huge color contrast. The only color contrast we have is between the tungsten and the white light. Now you can have a million different readings on this, but maybe one reading is the idea to create a contrast between Jesse James and the train. And this idea that now Jesse James is about to rob this train with his gang and probably commit murder. And as we have this kind of nice quiet moment with him, we push into the darkness. We push into the shadow. And the train could maybe represent this, not necessarily peaceful force, but like an innocent force. And, you know, the innocent victims that are going to be on this train and that are going to be taken over by Jesse James and his gang, right? That idea of this sort of like purification of the darkness with this light. You know, that's a very kind of grand interpretation, but that's you know, totally fine. But that's one idea of sort of decoding it, but also just on a total visceral level, it feels a little unsettling. It feels a little scary, right? It feels a little sinister, foreboding. Something's going to happen. Okay. So again, normally I would do this with a bunch of, you know, takes. So I hope you have some. Okay. This was a long one. This was a long presentation, and I appreciate you staying with me. So again, we're not going to do this, but I hope you did on your own. And if, again, I talked through it, but if you ever want an example, looks like I kind of forgot I did this, but I took this key shot and broke it down through all the formal elements. So again, if you're ever kind of looking for some filmic evidence examples. And remember our 5 elements of cinematography. And that's it. Okay. So again, thank you for your patience on this one. I will see you next module. And next module is when I'll also talk about your assignment. All right. Thank you. See you next module.